Good evening and welcome to the school board meeting for January 23rd. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Welcome. Our board members at the table are as follows. We have Trustee St. John, Trustee Worden, Trustee Jupe, Trustee Cotton. To my left is Trustee Brumbaugh, Trustee Pappas, Dr. Dean, our superintendent. We have our two assistant superintendents, Dr. Bishop and Amanda Matheson. Welcome. Next is the approval of the board agenda for January 23rd. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
I'm sorry, was that Ms. Worden? Thank you. Moved by Trustee Worden, seconded by Trustee Pappas. Any comments? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? 7-0. Next we go on to number 3, Superintendent's Report. First we have the GPEA Good News Report. And I see Ms. Shelson in the audience. Welcome, welcome.
Good evening. Thank you for continuing the GPA update once a month at the board meeting. We appreciate the opportunity to let the board know what we are working on with the district and what is important to teachers. We have looked at the budget parameters and are heartened to see an emphasis in making teachers a priority. Parameters 5, 6, 12, 13, amongst others, have potential to help staff with staff morale and hopefully staff retention. We are curious to hear the specific details of each parameter and how it will ultimately affect Grosse Pointe Public Schools. We want the board and public to understand when we are talking about who the GPA represents, we are advocating for the following: counselors, classroom teachers, social workers, nurses, reading specialists, media specialists, school psychologists, occupational therapists, as well as physical therapists. Sometimes people only think teachers, so we represent them all. We continue to work with the district on important topics, including anything from scheduling, committee work, and communications. We have found value in understanding the processes and working together to find improvements that can be made. We want to thank board members for taking the time to talk to the GPA on the issues that are ongoing at this time. We look forward to engaging in the committee work once the committees are finalized and meetings set. We appreciate that the board, like us, view the teachers as important stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, we have item 3.2, Good News Report. Mary Ann Brush. Welcome, Mary Ann.
Good evening. It's nice to see you all. As you may know, January is School Board Appreciation Month. Michigan is home to nearly 600 locally elected school boards, and the Grosse Pointe Public School System joins the Michigan Association of School Boards, Michigan Department of Education, and other local school districts to recognize and raise awareness of the countless efforts and contributions of local school boards and school board members. At each of your seats, you will see there's a certificate of appreciation and a small gift for you in recognition of your service. Spoiler alert, the gift is a calendar. And I apologize we didn't get it to you sooner, but we needed to wait until all the meeting dates were approved at your organizational meeting on the 4th. Whether you keep this in your home or office, we hope it will be a useful tool to you and also a reminder of the array of things that occur in just one calendar year throughout the district. I wanted to quickly walk you through the pages of the calendar for the public to enjoy. It's always helpful when a new year begins to look back and reflect on the year that has passed. And full disclosure, not all the events represented in the calendar necessarily took place in the month where they appear, but our focus was representing as many buildings and events and activities as possible. Okay. The remote doesn't seem to be working. Mary, sorry. In the top photo, Parcell's social studies teacher, Steve Chevalier, brought a special guest to Parcells to demonstrate to his 7th grade social studies classes that it's a big world after all. Sean McBrady, a district parent, is a Macomb ISD social studies consultant and regularly visits Grosse Pointe classrooms with his giant interactive maps. In the photo below, students at Mason Elementary challenged themselves to see how they stacked up in a worldwide initiative with stacking cups and a 30-second timer. They participated in the 2022 Stack Up in partnership with the World Speed Stacking Association. Who knew this was a junior Olympic sport? Gym teacher Caitlin Kefkin brought it to her students not just because it's fun to break a world record, but because it helps with hand-eye coordination, balance, and cross-body-brain connection. Next, in February, is Black History Month. Last year, Monteith parent Nafisa Simonet brought a bold idea to the school to create a collective mural of contemporary influences from the African diaspora, and through a combination of art and literature, teach children about 22 changemakers and their contributions. Pictured here are last year's 2nd graders in Pam Albrecht's classroom, who learned how their changemaker, Garrett Morgan, made American life better through his inventions. Next is March, which is Reading Month. Pictured here is Deputy Superintendent Roy Bishop reading to a preschooler. Any month is good to celebrate our heroes, as this Richard student is doing here, pictured with his hero, Principal John Kernan. The Bot Masters and All-Girls Robotics Club at Pierce Middle School enjoyed a successful season, and these young men tinkering with a computer are actually learning about hacking in their cybersecurity class at North. Cybersecurity is one of the many offerings in our robust CTE program. If you'd like to learn more about our CTE program, there's a flyer at the back of the room. On the flip side of the flyer is information about Skilled Trades Career Night at North on February 28 from 6 to 8 p.m. Grosse Pointe South enjoyed a first-of-its-kind event last spring, a Champions of Change celebration focused on kindness and diversity, hosted by special education teachers and students. The event grew out of a grant from Special Olympics Unified Champion Schools to supplement the school's peer-to-peer program, which brings together students from the general education population with students with special needs. And next month, this little boy is enjoying Fairy's Day of Awesomeness, and this Fairy leader is showing off her Leader in Me t-shirt. Fairy, along with all the elementary schools in the district, is a Leader in Me school. And June, of course, marks the culmination of our students' GPPSS experience, whether they joined us in preschool or somewhere at some time in high school. The commencement ceremonies at both Grosse Pointe North and Grosse Pointe South are a highlight for all community members, but I know it's a special honor for board members to sit on stage at both high schools as our graduates receive their diplomas. Summer in Grosse Pointe is filled with camp opportunities, from Camp Invention to the Grosse Pointe School's Summer Theater Camp. This summer, in roughly 9 rehearsal days, director and choreographer Michelle Stackpool, music director Heather Albrecht, and producer Sarah Duffield, all teachers in the district, and a cast of 58, brought the Young Performers edition of The Wizard of Oz to life on stage. Pictured here is an all-school ceremonial flag raising at Parcells at the start of the school year in honor of Constitution Week. The ceremony, which included the reciting of the Pledge of Allegiance, was led by members of the Louisa St. Clair chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. All the 5th graders remained at the close of the ceremony to recite the preamble to the Constitution. And here are some scenes from the start of school last fall, including Mare Elementary's new principal, Nicole Felicia, with students at morning arrival. All the staff at Mare dressed as superheroes to surprise students during the first week of school. In October, we hosted the GPPSS Community Tailgate before the annual North versus South football rivalry held this year at North. In addition to fun activities, food trucks, a visit by high school mascots, live music by the Boys of Summer, and a joint performance by the 2 schools' marching bands, the events featured nearly 24 tables of community resources. Another event in October that brought 2 school communities together was a tricycle relay race held on the street in front of Pierce and Defer. Pierce principal Sarah Dirksey and Defer principal Lisa Ream agreed to race one another to inspire their students to help meet each school's Fun Run fundraising goals. It was a tight race, but here you can see Mrs. Dirksey in the lead, cheered on by an enthusiastic crowd of supporters on the sidelines. November is Veterans Day, and 5th graders in Michelle Orhan's social studies class at Pierce honored veterans in their lives with a Veterans Wall of Honor. Represented on this wall were multiple generations in wars going back as far as the Civil War, as one student was able to trace his ancestry back to his great-great-grandfather, General William Sherman. Other fall highlights were Brownell and Pierce 8th grade trips to Washington, D.C. with visits to a number of monuments. Parcells 8th graders are scheduled to head to D.C. in the spring. We also hosted our district-wide open house. Pictured here are Kirby Cougars waiting to greet their special visitors. And finally, on the lower left, our students at Parcells preparing turkeys as part of the 7th grade life skills classes. Combined, Parcells and Brownell roasted 48 turkeys to be donated to Motor City Mitten Mission for distribution over the Thanksgiving holiday. And finally, the performing arts are alive and well in the school district. Pictured here are some leads from North's production of Beauty and the Beast, and student musicians on the lower photo from North and South on the stage at South, with professional musicians from the Harlem String Quartet who conducted a master class, and that was brought to us from the Grosse Pointe Foundation for Public Education. These are just snapshots of the full 2022 calendar year, most of which was shared in our district communications, social media posts, or in previous Good News reports to the board. We look forward to what lies ahead for 2023. And if you'd like to keep up with district news, feel free to subscribe to the, next slide, Mary. Feel free to subscribe to our weekly GPPSS update, the news you can use, or Friday School Points by emailing info@gpschools.org. We also have a sign-up sheet at the back of the auditorium. Be sure to provide your email address on your way out this evening. You can also visit our website at gpschools.org and see the latest edition of each on the home page under news. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Brush. Can you tell me where somebody would obtain a calendar if they wanted to order one?
They could contact info@gpschools.org.
Great. info@gpschools.org. Great. Thank you so much. Item 3.3, budget update. Mrs. Matheson.
Thank you. Let me just get my version up here, and I will need Mrs. Howlett's assistance or Mrs. Brush, one of the two, with navigating through the slides. So Trustee Ismail and Trustee Cotton have asked me to prepare a Grosse Pointe Public School System finance historical review as part of the kickoff to our budget season. And of course, later today, we will be discussing the budget parameters being recommended from the treasurer for the 2023-24 school year. So if we can advance to the next slide, the first slide that I have for you is the foundation allowance. This is the per pupil revenue that we receive from the state of Michigan. The full amount is received from a combination of local property taxes received from the operating and hold harmless millages, with the balance being paid by the state. So you can see going back to 1995, which is when Proposal A had taken effect, we started out with a foundation allowance of $8,393 per pupil. Today, that has increased to $10,837 per pupil. And currently, on a per pupil basis, that $10,837 is actually paid locally by our property tax collections, and the amount is $1,695 in hold harmless millage per pupil, $1,531.82 in operating millage on a per pupil basis, and then the balance of $7,610.18 is what is actually paid by the state. So as we move through these slides tonight, you'll see some allocations of our revenue by source, and that local component of our revenue is a majority property tax collections, while the state is the foundation allowance, as well as categorical state funding, which is essentially state grants. On the next slide, I feel like it's important to not only talk about the increases in per pupil funding in the foundation allowance, but also to talk about the retirement rate. So we are part of the Michigan Public Schools Employees Retirement System, also referred to as MIPSers. We currently pay about 45 cents on every dollar of compensation into the pension system. The district portion is currently 28.23%. However, please compare that back to the 1995-96 rate, which was 14.56%. So that comparison is the blue portion of these bars only. When you see in 2013-14, the orange portion coming in, that's when the state started assessing the unfunded actuarial accrued liability pension rate. It's grown every year. also known as UAAL. What that is an additional portion that's defined by a rate that we have to apply to our employees' compensation and remit to the Office of Retirement Services. But the state is also giving us a state categorical, so they're essentially giving us money specifically to fund that portion of the retirement. So the combination of the 28.23% that is a district obligation and the UAAL of 16.65% has our total for this year at 44.88%. This is legislatively mandated, so we cannot opt out of this system. It is something that we have to plan for all of the staff members that are directly employed by the district. The next slide we have is the Grosse Pointe Public School System enrollment history. We first want to go and look back all the way to the 1975-76 school year. You'll see that enrollment was at its highest with 11,145 students. At that time, we had 8 elementary, 3 middle, and 2 high schools. When the board voted to close 2 elementary schools in 2019, our enrollment was down 3,509 students, which was a decline of almost 32%. Today, our elementary and middle school facility utilization is averaged at 67%, while the high school utilization is at 57%. So that slide was a little busy, so I'm going to take off a few years of that information. And this next slide goes back to about the Proposal A timeframe, so we're getting back to the 1994-95 school year. And we're going forward a little further. The purple line at the top is sharing with you the state pupil enrollment, and then they actually start estimating with the current year at 2022-23. They finalize that after the year is completed. And they only estimate out 2 years beyond current. So 2020-21, I want to point out that we had budgeted for a reduction of 200 pupils on a full-time equivalent basis, but we realized a loss of 515 FTE. So that definitely hit us hard that year. Since then, we have been utilizing the Plant Moran Cressa enrollment projections, which has us continuing to decline for each of the next 5 years, generally somewhere in the 145, 135, the losses are a little bit less each year, but nonetheless a decline for each of the next 5 years. When we had made that projection to lose 200, where we actually lost 515, that was, we were putting efforts in place to recruit families back that had left us during the pandemic. Unfortunately, we did not come close to hitting our target, and since then have just learned to go with the Plant Moran enrollment projection. And if it adjusts from there in a positive or negative direction, such as life, and we move forward and adjust that in our budget accordingly. Our next slide shows our actual revenue by source from 2010-11 through our most recently completed fiscal year, 2021-22. In 2020-21, we created a separate fund for our special education center programs that are primarily funded by Act 18. This created a reduction in inter-district sources, which is that yellow that you see in the years 2010-11 all the way through 2019-20, but an increase in transfers in. And what that is the indirect costs that we are authorized to charge our Special Education Act 18 Center program classes, and then bring that back into the general fund. This has always been in existence while we have been operating the center programs here in our district. You just couldn't see it as clearly because everything was accounted for in the general fund. Now that we have a separate fund established for our Act 18 programs, you can actually see the indirect costs coming back into the general fund. In 2020-21, we also received an influx of federal funds associated with the pandemic, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more as we continue through this presentation. The last slide only went through the 2021-22 fiscal year, as that was our most recently completed fiscal year for actual data. This slide shows the same categories of general fund revenue by source for the current board-approved budget. So you can see that 65.87% is in state sources. That is a combination of the foundation allowance, which is unrestricted revenue for us to use on Salaries, benefits, quite honestly, it can be spent on building improvements, but we're fortunate to have a bond issue and sinking fund that we're not spending a significant amount on building improvements. The next slide is showing you the way our pandemic relief funding has come into our district. So we saw an increase in our federal revenue in 2020-21 when a variety of pandemic relief grants were added to local education agencies. This graph shows all pandemic relief funding awarded to date. You'll notice the overlap of funding sources in each year. It's also important to note that these grants must be spent by the end of 2023-24 school year. I think it's also important to recognize that expenditures of an amount equal to the revenue must also be eliminated, as we cannot sustain the expenditures when the restricted funds sunset at the end of the 2023-24 school year. This next slide shows the general fund expenditures by object from 2010-11 through our most recently completed fiscal year. Salaries and benefits for our staff always make up the most significant portion of our spending. Purchase services, supplies and materials, and capital outlay, other and outgoing transfers are the remaining categories. Outgoing transfers were part of our budget through 2014-15 to repay debt that was essentially a non-voted bond, meaning that we did not have to go out to the community and ask for their permission on a ballot. We were able to do that through the board approving, and I can't tell you what year, I didn't go back that far to tell you when it started, but the board ultimately approved for us to borrow money that we then repaid through the general fund. So once that was repaid in full, then you stop seeing any significant amount for outgoing transfers. Let's see here. Many people also think that capital outlay is only improvements and repairs on buildings, but in our case, we pay for those costs through our bond and sinking fund as capital outlay. For us, it's typically around technology purchases. So in the most recent years, our fiber ring for internet and multifunction devices for scanning, copying, and printing were all paid from the general fund as a capital outlay item. This next slide gives us a look at our 2022-23 general fund expenditures by the same object code categories. This is looking at the most recent board-approved budget. About 85% of our total budget is spent on salaries and benefits for employees, which is always the most significant expense for any school district in our state. The next slide is the general fund balance. So this first look is taking you all the way back to the 1993-94 school year, going all the way up through 2022-23. So please note that the 2022-23 amount is an estimate that's based on our current board-approved budget. And I have the dollar amounts that are right above all of the bars for each of these years. But the slide that I want to focus more on is on the next screen. While fund balance is often used as a measure of fiscal health, there are two large reasons having a fund balance is important. First, it allows us to absorb sudden disruptions in funding or unanticipated expenditures. Second, it allows us to have cash resources necessary to get us through the fall, where we have no state aid in September and do not collect any local property taxes until winter tax bills are paid. This slide shows our fund balance in columns and our enrollment change in orange and foundation change in gray. So looking at a couple of key years here, in 2011-12, we received a mid-year proration in our state funding. Our foundation allowance was cut by $470 mid-year. I was not in Grosse Pointe at that time, but I was in another school district in the state, and I suspect that Grosse Pointe did the exact same thing that all of the other districts, or many of the other districts in the state did, which was to utilize their fund balance to be able to keep their operations as they were, because this change came about in January. So right in the middle of the school year, you know, everything's in place, your classes are in place, your students are here, your teachers are here, and the state cuts us $470 per pupil. Then in 1920, our fund balance was at a high. It was at 18.15% of expenditures. Per our collective bargaining agreements, the formula kicked in, which requires us to share 50% of the surplus over the 15% fund balance as a percent of expenditures with our employees, which resulted in our fund equity going down in 2021 by about $1.6 million. Then as you look at 2021-22, our per pupil hold harmless decreased by $198 per pupil. This was the first ever reduction since Proposal A was passed in 1994. And additionally, you'll see our enrollment loss of 515 full-time equivalent students. However, from a funding perspective, this was also the year that the super blend went away. So we actually realized on the financial side a loss of 702 full-time equivalent students when it comes to the state revenue we were receiving. The pandemic relief funding we've been allocated has allowed us to maintain our programs and even add to staff for some specific reasons to help students recover from the pandemic and not be in a worse financial position than where we truly otherwise would have been without it. The next slide shows our actual fund balance, revenue, and expenditures from 2010-11 through the current year. 2010-11 through 2021-22 are actual numbers, while 2022-23 represents the current board-approved budget. From an accounting perspective, we have our fund balance plus revenue available that can be allocated toward expenditures. Each year, that gray line for expenditures, when it's in the blue, we are able to cover our current year operations with our current year revenue. Conversely, our expenditures exceeded our revenue in the years that the expenditure line is within the orange block representing our fund balance. On the next slide, I want to take just a moment to look a little bit at how our decisions to not make drastic cuts have helped our students. This is a slide from our October 2022 presentation done by Mr. Howell showing the reading learning loss of Grosse Pointe Public School System students in 2019, 2021, and 2022 in comparison to national averages. Grade level averages improved slightly in 3rd, 4th, and 7th grades. 5th, 6th, and 8th saw slight decreases, but less than the national decrease, and in every grade level, our average score either increased or had less of a decrease than the national trends. The next slide is essentially the same data, but for math learning loss. Grade level averages improved or stayed consistent in 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. Decreases in 7th and 8th grades were less than national decreases, and again, in every grade level, our average score either increased or had less of a decrease than the national trends. While our prior slides looked at grades 3 through 8, this slide focuses on our high school students. You'll see that, again, GPPSS students regularly perform better than the state and national average. As you look at our own data, there are small fluctuations year over year, but our average scores have remained fairly consistent throughout the pandemic. While most of our students have suffered in some way from the learning loss associated with the pandemic, we also recognize that our Black, economically disadvantaged, and special education students have been impacted disproportionately from the remainder of our student population. Our Section 11T funds are being utilized to provide assistance to these specific subgroups, while our ESSER 3 allocation is being used for the more general population. So in summary, the state funding is in fact at an all-time high, but both state and Grosse Pointe enrollment is at an all-time low. These enrollment losses leave districts to make one of two decisions. We can either allow schools of choice to fill the seats or close schools. So while many different people have sat in these board seats, the decision is to not participate in schools of choice has been consistent year over year. We also experienced our first ever reduction in per pupil hold harmless funding, going from $1,893 per pupil to $1,695 per pupil in 2021-22 school year. The $15.3 million in pandemic relief funding is helping us to make intentional decisions on how and when we make adjustments to our programs to ensure we are having a positive impact on student achievement and well-being. But we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that expenditure reductions will be necessary over the next 2 years because we cannot sustain expenditures at this level when the pandemic relief funding sunsets. So the next steps that we will be going through, these are some highlights from our budget development timeline. There will be additional things incorporated, such as Finance and Facilities Committee meetings and budget updates to the complete board at the will of the committee. But starting out on January 25th, we will have the governor's 2023 State of the State. February 13th, our Board of Ed will be adopting the 2023-24 budget parameters. Sometime in February, which we're told early February, the governor will share her budget proposal. And then March and April is the timeframe where the legislature deliberates, and at some point, we will have a budget proposal from both the House and Senate. Nothing will be finalized, though, until after the May 2023 Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference. And then for us, as a school district, June 12th will be our public hearing on the 2023-24 budget. Proposed budget. This is a legislative component that we have to do every year. And then on June 26th, unless the board chooses to call a special meeting before June 30th, we would be intending to adopt the 2023-24 budget for next year. So this is the high-level overview of our financial history that I wanted to start out with sharing. I think it will dovetail nicely into Mr. Cotton's presentation later today with the discussion on budget parameters, but I'd be happy to take any questions from board members at this time.
St. John.
So, thank you for a very good presentation. It was really comprehensive, and you explained it very well for people who don't have a financial background like myself. One question I had, because I was not even in Michigan in 2011, so I've been playing a lot of catch up with trainings and things on Prop A and how that all works. Why was there a mid-year foundation allowance cut in 2011, and do you have any reason to anticipate that that could happen again?
So currently, well, will it happen again? It could happen again at some point in the future. It's really all driven by these consensus revenue estimating conferences and the amount of money that is coming into the school aid fund. However, at that time, the state was in a recession essentially, and they did not have as much money coming in to the school aid fund, and that was their means of balancing out their budget, was to reduce the amount of money they were paying to all of the school districts in the state.
Was it a legislative decision?
I believe.
Yes.
It was-
Okay.
There was a budget crisis. Both the school aid fund and the general fund were upside down, and there were significant reductions on both. It was, has to be done. All the appropriations have to be done by the legislature in combination with the governor.
Okay, thanks.
Mrs. Worden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the excellent presentation, Mrs. Matheson. I know you're not someone that can look into the future, but given the fact that so many school districts are dependent on that COVID money or the ESSER's money, do you anticipate that the federal government, from what you've learned or researched from other school districts or MASB, that any of these ESSER's fundings might be continued in another form or called something different?
So right now, I have not heard any conversation about that. I was just attending a virtual conference at the beginning of last week, and although there are sometimes remaining allocations, so there was ESSER 2 that was, prior to ESSER 3, there was some additional funding that was not used, and the state has then gone through and reallocated that for the specific purpose that it was intended. So sometimes there's a little bit of residual that has been coming forward, and they allow for an extension, but they usually do that under a new section number as well, and put new dates on in terms of when it has to be spent by. So right now, I'm not seeing anything. Is it possible? I think it is entirely possible, but what it looks like and what form it has, whether it's considered federal revenue, or if it's considered a state categorical, that's definitely to be determined.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Brumbaugh.
Mary Ann, I don't know if it's possible to go back to the foundation allowance slide on number 2. Just like one of the things that always strikes me looking at this is, foundation allowance from 95 to present has increased about 30%, but adjusted for inflation, that should have been about 195%, if I'm correct, right? It should be about $16,000 or $17,000. Is that?
I didn't go the
correct?
direction of inflation tonight because I was trying to keep it high level, but I agree. Yeah.
I mean, I just think it's important for the community to understand that this sounds like a lot per pupil, but when you talk about almost 20 years, we're about 50% of the funding level at the state level where we should be to just do the things we did in 1995, which is why a couple of times on stage I've asked you to write your state legislature, so let them know. And I mean, with the retirement rate, the payout, rates increased by about three times, I think, over the same time period. So it's, I know that those are two big the driving kind of gears of the budget. And it's impressive to see how well our district has done with funding that just does not keep up with inflation and with our growing infrastructure needs. I think that was the main thing I just wanted to point out.
Mrs. Pappas?
I just wanted to piggyback off of that, Trustee Brumbaugh, because we're also a unique state in that we don't, the state doesn't allocate money for facilities fixtures, where other states that is often allocated to fix buildings, and we struggle in this district in particular in comparison to some of our neighbors, because we have very old buildings that were built in a different era and require, anything you fix on our buildings, it seems to turn into a bigger expense than when we started. So it's just a unique part of Michigan funding that we deal with. We pass bonds. We passed a bond, we have a sinking fund, and those things are to go to our facilities. But it's not included. There's been some talk, I know in chatter I've heard recently about Michigan changing maybe, to match other states. But until that happens, our only way of fixing these aging buildings is with our bond, which, we've gone through pretty much all of what we passed in 2018. We have a lot of critical needs, and then we have our sinking funds. So those dollars we have to be really good with, especially in the height of what is looking like a very huge recession and a lot of inflation. And so these are the numbers. We have our salaries and health care, it has gone up, it goes up every year, and we are paying out a majority, for salaries and health benefits, and we want our staff to have fabulous, we want them to be well-paid and have great health care. But we also have to balance that against the actual funds that are coming in, which have not kept pace with inflation by any means. And then we have, again, the aging building, critical needs. So just wanted to piggyback so people are aware that we don't have a lot of flexibility as far as those funds to fix buildings, as other states handle that differently.
Thank you. Any other comments? One quick question, Mrs. Matheson. The fund balance, I know that the Michigan School Board officials recommend that we maintain a fund balance of 15 to 20%. What fund balance do we need? I know we still do borrowing over the course of the year to cover expenses as we're waiting for tax revenues to come in. What fund balance would you need to have so that we don't have to borrow?
We need to be right around 12 to 14% so that we don't need to borrow during those timeframes where we don't have revenue coming in to cover our expenditures.
And what is our interest expense that we've paid on those years that we don't have that 12? Do you have a guesstimate on what an annual interest?
So it's an adjustable rate. We looked at it the other day together when Treasurer Cotton was at the office. It's an adjustable rate based on LIBOR. I have not looked at how that's equating to the dollars for this year.
Okay.
We actually did not have to borrow for the last 2 years.
Great.
Prior to that, we had, and this year we had to borrow again. And it's a short-term line of credit that we asked the board to approve annually. Then we have the flexibility to draw on it when we have tight cash flow needs, and then we repay it as our property taxes start coming in this time of year.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you putting this together.
President, can I make a quick note?
Sorry.
You said 15 to 20% is a recommendation?
Right.
At all the trainings that I've done recently, and it might have changed just based on, the way school funding has changed or the economy or something, but all the trainings I've done recently have just recommended 10 to 15% fund equity.
Like, I'll send you MSBO has a good tutorial on fund balance and what to shoot for.
Okay, yeah.
I can send that over to you. It's a great article.
That's what I had
No problem.
done the training on.
Thank you again. Next, we have public comment on action agenda items. We have one speaker, Mr. Fox.
Do you want to read the rules?
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Let me read the rules here. We welcome comments and questions related to matters within the purview of the Board of Education. Prior to addressing the board, we recommend that speakers first discuss their topic and seek resolution with relevant staff and administrators. culminating with the superintendent. The board will not discuss individual student or staff matters or pending litigation in this forum, and the chair will rule those comments out of order, as well as any commenters who use inappropriate language such as profanity or other language that disrupts the order of the meeting. Comments are addressed to the chair and are limited to 3 minutes, but we are happy to discuss any matters further outside this formal meeting. When called to the podium, please state your name and city of residence. Okay. Mr. Fox, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Hello, Board. I'm Joshua Neds Fox of Grosse Pointe Farms. I'd like to speak to the consideration of board meeting starting times today and comment before the approval of minutes from the last few board meetings. I encourage the board to maintain the 7 p.m. starting time, to provide support staff, the public, and trustees with a reasonable margin of time after our daily responsibilities to prepare for the critical business of the board. These hours allow commuters and parents to manage their evening business and still attend board meetings. They give staff a chance to breathe before resuming school business after serving our students all day, and of course they allow you, the trustees, adequate time to prepare for board meetings. Reducing this margin can only degrade these activities, while moving the start time later increases the likelihood that the same stakeholders will struggle to stay through the meeting. Both diminish the quality of outcomes from our board meetings. I also want to note that the board has, over the past few years, resumed the practice of providing a capsule condensation of public and trustee comments in its minutes. This practice is not required under the board's meeting policy and is undertaken as a public service, I understand. But these condensations are often poor representations of the character and intent of the speaker's words and create a false historical record in the minutes that color future assessment of the decisions the board makes. The minutes of January 19th, for instance, suggest that 45 attendees talked about the health clinic, quote unquote, but the true story of the evening is that 35 of those speakers, or 3 out of 4, asked you to reject the resolution that you ultimately passed. The same minutes suggest that Dr. Dean merely discussed the challenge of being a leader in his closing remarks and obscure his warnings that reversal of board decisions is an erosion of trust with the community. These are 2 examples of the editing by omission that necessarily happens when the secretary abridges the public record. While I appreciate the effort that goes into writing these brief and hopefully unbiased abstracts, I think this practice does a disservice to the often impassioned and thoughtful reasoning on display here. I suggest that these condensations either be replaced with automatic transcripts from the audio feed or abandoned as a practice until an approach can be found that does service to the full import of the oratory that occurs each month at these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Rosie Knapp.
Hello again. My name is Rosie Knapp. I'm from Grosse Pointe Farms. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Mr. Fox. I believe that was your name. If I didn't get it right, I apologize. Thank you for those eloquent words, well thought out statement. It is much appreciated by me, and I'm sure some others in this room. I'm just going to ask you to please take some very thoughtful consideration in the time change of the meetings. I echo Mr. Fox's statements regarding the possible issues that it would propose to the staff, to families and whatnot. I already struggle to be here by 7 o'clock. I'm never here on time because I have duties at home that I need to take care of before I get here. I have to feed my family. I have to do various other things before I leave the house. So just please take that into consideration, that a lot of your community members also struggle to be here on time, would struggle to be here any time earlier than 7. Definitely 6:30 would be like, nobody would be here. So unless you guys really want to have a school board meeting every time with people being here an hour late, I hope that you do not go for anything earlier than 6:30, and even 6:30 will be a burden to many people. I also heard today that there are some activities that go on in this room on the days that you meet that go past 6 o'clock or 6:30, so you may want to look into that as well if you haven't yet. That's it. Thanks. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Next, we go on to action agenda items for January 23rd. The first is the 5.1 approval of regular meeting minutes from December 19, 2022. Do I have a motion to approve those?
So moved.
Mr. Brumbaugh, and a support?
Support.
Support by Mrs. Pappas. Any comments? Seeing no comments, all those in favor of approving the minutes of December 19, 2022, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Nay? Any nays? 7-0. Next, we move on to 5.2, approval of regular meeting minutes of January 9, 2023. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
So moved by
Be the
Mr.
minutes man,
Brumbaugh,
so.
I'll support.
support by Mrs. Pappas. Any comments? Seeing no comments, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? 7-0. Next, we move to the approval of the special meeting minutes for January 19, 2023. Do I have a motion to approve said minutes? Mr. Brumbaugh?
Support, might as well make it a triple.
I'm sorry.
I don't have the minutes from our special meeting last Thursday. That's what we're approving for 5.3?
January 19, that's correct.
Yeah, I didn't get that in my packet, so.
The packet was published on Friday. I believe you only got the digital copy of the minutes because
Oh.
it wasn't able to get the paper copy done, given that that meeting, ended at 10 o'clock on Thursday night.
Yeah.
So yes,
Absolutely.
the digital.
That's why I was surprised to see
It was
it.
on the website. It was
Okay.
also on the website for the community to be able to see as well.
Okay,
I have
well,
a printed copy if you want to take a look at it.
yeah, if you could pass it down real
Sure.
quick, just to make sure. I don't want to vote on something that I didn't see.
No, that's fine. Let's see, 19th, here you go.
While Trustee St. John is looking at that, to speak to Mr. Neds Fox's comment, I don't know if the president or superintendent would want to talk about the policy, but I believe that we've discussed kind of how to hit that right point in terms of precision and brevity there before. So I would, not to put either of you on the spot, but maybe if you could give a little bit of context as to how we do the minutes.
Absolutely. So let me talk to you about the legal portion, and then let me talk about how it happens. The legal portion is the minutes are a record of the board's actions. The board speaks through its votes. So that is technically the only thing that needs to be in the minutes. You know what I'm saying? So, for example, Mrs. Matheson's presentation there isn't an action the board took. It doesn't have to be there. As a courtesy, we certainly try to, and by we, it's Mrs. Fuga in the back and me. I recognize the board secretary is Mrs. Jupe, okay? But she delegates that responsibility to Mrs. Fuga, and Mrs. Fuga spends the couple days after a board meeting watching meetings over and over. Sometimes she can't even understand the audio, so she calls Mr. Ishmael like she did last week. Like that happens, right?
She's wonderful at
And
it. We love you, Mrs.
she
Fuga.
tries to keep the summary as brief as possible, so I'll be transparent on the comments from, I think, the 47 or 49 speakers the last time. Mr. Neds Fox was correct. We wrote the same thing. Mrs. Smith spoke about the clinic. Because sometimes, and I know as a person who sits up here, trying to distill that to anything less than the 3 minutes is challenging, because sometimes it's really clear and sometimes it's not. So we do keep digital copies of our meetings, so if someone wants to, and I've actually done this, go back and see what somebody said in 2016, they are welcome to do that, and that would be the best place to do it. But we do try to record who spoke, their city of residence, and like the general topic they spoke on, recognizing under state law we don't have to do that. But we do it as a courtesy, and I will tell you, at least once a year, someone comes up and says, you're doing too much, too little. It is rarely the Goldilocks moment of just right. And I think it's one of those things that is no way to get it right, because half this room wants more, half this room wants less. So finding it, the middle ground is very hard. But I appreciate Mrs. Fuga, and we'll always keep changing it as necessary.
If I can offer something that might be helpful, once we get closed captioning on the meetings, which we are still working on, I promise we're not forgetting, it's in development, then that transcript would be available too for people who can't watch the whole 4-hour meeting and just want to skim to see what happens.
And I would love us to get to closed captioning, but I would tell you almost every audio transcript has a error rate inside of it. And like I imagine, like our last board meeting, there were probably at least 10,000 words spoken. And an error rate of 5% or whatever the percent is, I guarantee you someone there would say, I didn't, I said, wish the board luck, and it comes out as the word duck. Do you know what I'm saying? And I probably could have picked a better example there, but I'm going to stick in that one, right? Okay,
Good move.
so like, thank you. So like, all of a sudden, a person says, but you didn't catch that they wrote the word duck. And like, now all of a sudden, we're chasing our tail on that piece. The best way for the community to know what happened at the board meeting is to watch the recorded live stream. We are certainly in favor of trying to find a way to get to, different ways for people with different needs, but it will never be perfect.
When we talk about error rates and things like that, as far as the audio, I just want to reiterate that there are moments up here, and it's gotten much better, but we had meetings last year that there were some very, unusual kinds of events, and the comments, what we were hearing up here was very muddled
Garbled.
on the audio, and sometimes I go back and if I have a question, I'll go back and we rewatch a meeting, and it's amazing how clear some of what we say into these mics comes through in that replay, but that's not necessarily what we heard up here. So sometimes if I'm sitting on this end, I don't hear well the people speaking on this end, and that's because of the way the audio is coming back, and it also comes through the mics. Sometimes somebody's really close to the mic and it's very, it's garbled, and we can't always hear people as clearly as I think we need to sometimes. So I think that's something that the community, hopefully, if you can understand that, to give us a little grace, because we don't always hear. When I have replayed things on the replay, I went, I didn't hear it like that, and it was kind of a wake up for me that this is what people are hearing maybe out there or hearing on the live stream, and they were hearing a more accurate version than what I was hearing up here. So I just think I hope maybe we can keep working on our audio to make it clearer, but it's tough sometimes up here because we lose sometimes what's being said at times.
Okay, so we are on 5.3, approval of special meeting minutes of January 19th. Mr. Brumbaugh, you made your motion, Mrs. Pappas seconded it. All those in favor say aye. 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 Any opposed? 7-0. Next, we are on 5.4, the approval of the Human Resources Report for January 2023. Dr. Dean, are you going to lead us through that?
Sure. The items are all routine in nature, small number of typical comings and goings in place.
Do I have a motion to accept the Human Resources Report for January 23? So moved by Mrs. Worden. Any support?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Jupe. Any comments? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? 7-0. Next, we go on to the approval of the adjusted start time for BOE meetings. I can do a brief lead-in on this. Initially, I believe it was at our January 9th meeting, the subject came up of changing the meeting start time from 7 p.m. to 6 p.m. Mrs. Worden made a valid argument that we should compromise and make it at 6:30, and I think that's a way to go. And in fact, I'd make a motion that we have our meeting start time at 6:30.
I'll make the motion.
Okay. Okay, so Mrs. Pappas is making the motion. Is there support?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Cotton. Is there any comment?
Can I make one?
I'm sorry.
Can I make one? Do you mind?
Go right ahead.
I assume this applies to regular meetings. Like
That's
we still
correct.
might, just for clarity for the audience.
Right.
So this is regular meetings. So like the next meeting on February 13th will now be at 6:30, assuming this passes.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And in fact, we have a meeting on Wednesday. It's starting at 6. So.
Just for clarity for the community. That's all I was
Thank
asking
you.
for.
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
Have you spoken to the building leadership or PTO and extracurricular activities who utilize the Brownell MPR and made sure that it's possible to move it earlier?
PJ went through that.
Yes, I spoke to Mr. Veltri. He's back there. He would smile and say, "It will be work, but we can make it work." And next year, we'll make some adjustments so it'll even be easier. But 6:30 is a compromise we meeting administration and his team can make work. He's nodding his head.
Thank you, Mr. Veltri. Any other comments?
That was going to be my question. Is,
Okay.
can we make it work? And if not, should we talk about delayed implementation like we did with
If
the
we can't
change
get
of date?
Mr. Veltri happy, then we have to keep him happy.
If I
Okay?
could make a comment too, I haven't heard or here at the podium or via our email, we've gotten a few emails about the start time and they've all requested that they stay at 7. I haven't heard any members of the public requesting that the meetings be moved earlier. So I'm just wondering how this came about. Was like a teacher requested, was it staff? Why are we moving it earlier?
Well, initially, it was a board member request, and it was discussed, and 6 o'clock was too early. Everybody felt 6 o'clock was too early, and it created problems for Mr. Veltri. And Mrs. Worden brought up the compromise of 6:30, and that's how we're here.
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Mrs. Jude.
Yeah, during, many times I was trying to get people to come to the meetings also, and, you know, a lot of people have to put their kids to bed at 8:30, 9 o'clock, so it really is a good compromise to just try to move it up a little bit so that everyone can get here. I mean, there was even times when I had to leave meetings early because I have a child that I need to actually put to bed because she takes medicine at bedtime. So, you know, when we're here at 11 o'clock at night, the difference between 11 o'clock at night and 10:30 can make a big difference, so.
Mrs. Worden.
I would just like to say that most of the people that I talked to wanted the meeting to stay at 7, but I do know that there's probably administrators that don't live close to here that would probably, you know, there's that big lag time between 5 o'clock when work ends and then the meeting at 7. So it does appear to be a good compromise to be able to get, you know, home and feed your family and then maybe get out a little bit earlier. So I'm in favor of it if as long as teachers and administrators are okay with it.
Thank you. Any other comments? All those in favor of moving our regular meeting scheduled start times to 6:30, say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? No.
No.
7-0.
Oh, no,
I'm sorry.
I'm saying no, just
Nay?
because I haven't heard
Okay.
anyone request it, so.
6-1 then. Thank you. Next, we have action agenda items for February 13, 2023. 6.1, adoption of 2023-24 budget parameters. I know, Treasurer Cotton, you put an extensive amount of work in. People have given you their input. And if we could walk through your parameters one by one to get a final swath. What our goal is to get those finalized and so that February 13th, we can get a final approval and Mrs. Matheson can go on her way to budget nirvana. And if you could walk us through, that would be great.
I want to thank everybody for giving me feedback, including the administration. With your permission, President Ismail, I'm going to read each parameter, try and speak to which trustee either agrees with that or brought something like that up, and I apologize if I get that wrong. Please correct me. I may make a comment after that parameter, and then I'd like to have everybody comment on that parameter, including the administration, if they'd like to.
Sounds like a good methodology. Let's go.
So first off, we have the background from the bylaws, Board Policy 6.02. I don't think I need to read that specifically, but this language comes straight from our bylaws. And so I will start with parameter 1, student enrollment. Pursue and propose strategies and anticipated budget impact to halt and reverse Grosse Pointe Public School System's decade-long enrollment loss trend. Take into account both traditional competitors and new competitors. Avoid any changes to the GPPSS longstanding enrollment policies and practices. Student enrollment is the primary engine to our school finances. Over the last decade, the GPPSS has lost over 20% of our student enrollment. All proposals, actions, and decisions should be evaluated through the lens of the potential impact on student enrollment. Now, this, in my understanding, comes from Trustee Warden's budget parameter 5, Trustee Papps's budget parameters 1 and 8, and Trustee Jupe's parameters 5 and 10.
Trustee Brumbaugh.
Just a question on this. I know a lot of times when we talk about setting goals and objectives, we talk about SMART goals or targets. I know enrollment is a difficult one because, you know, we have our Plant Moran projections, we see the historical trends, and we can't really control in the fullest sense kind of who moves in and out of the district. Is there a thought as to what success looks like here, or is it a general kind of let's see what we can do, kind of give our best efforts on growing enrollment, and if it's successful, then that's great, but we're not going to set a target that's going to be hard to kind of bring reality to, I guess. I don't know if there are any thoughts on what success looks like here, if it is just putting our best effort in and seeing what we can accomplish, or is there a specific target that the other trustees have in mind?
Any comment on that? Mrs. Worden?
I just have a question, and I'm not sure if this is the right time to say it, but I agree with what you've said in here, but did we take the school of choice language out of this this particular budget parameter? I know it was in a different parameter last time, but is this going to be included in this budget parameter or any of these?
I would say avoid any changes to the GPPSS longstanding enrollment policies and practices, that's where you would find that.
Okay. But are we going to put that language in there specifically, like that we would avoid school of choice?
We can.
We can.
Okay.
Is that something you would prefer?
I would like that, yes, thank you.
No problem. Is that a problem, Mr. Cotton?
I don't think so.
Okay. Are you going to answer Mr. Brumbaugh? or would-
Oh, I didn't know if you were addressing that to everybody who had that parameter. I mean, for me,
It would just be to have a
success.
discussion about it, so.
Yeah.
No agenda there.
Yeah. I'd put that back to you and see if you have anything there.
I mean, I kind of intimated, I think there's a lot that goes on with enrollment that's hard to control, that I wouldn't want to set an unrealistic target. So I think doing what we have done, hey, let's do X, Y, and Z things. Let's ask administration to give us strategies that look like they're going to help drive enrollment, and then we'll say, hey, what worked and what didn't, you know? And if, but I don't know that a metric makes sense there. But I'm certainly open if people had other ideas on that. I wanted it to be a discussion.
Well, my metric is beat Plant Moran's estimates.
That's a good one.
If we can do better than Plant Moran's numbers. And I think, speaking for myself, Mr. Brumbaugh, I would like to see a brief summary from Dr. Dean or from his communications team on what we're doing in that regard. I think to set a hard metric on that is very difficult.
I agree.
And if we could get that, Dr. Dean, that would be much appreciated.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think this also speaks a lot to strategies to increase enrollment. I mean, looking to our professionals and you know, if we take this into account with the budget, what can we do? What are some strategies that we can do to reach out in the community to increase increase our enrollment?
Can I speak?
Mrs. Pappas.
Well, I think that I like the language when I saw this, when it says pursue and propose strategies and avoid any change to our longstanding enrollment, which would be schools of choice. We've turned that down every year for many, many years here. This has been a district that is made up of residents, and I think there's a lot of strength in that. But pursuing new strategies and finding strategies to reverse, I think there's a lot we can do putting our minds together, and it's one of the things I think is going to be so great about the Community Engagement Committee, because this is really getting ideas and things for how we can draw people into our area, or let people know that might not necessarily know what we offer. We have a certain amount of people, professionals that come in and out of our community. They move into our community. I've said for many, many years, I don't know why we're not the first stop, especially if you're working downtown. You've got an easy commute. That was a big decision factor when, we moved here for my husband. He didn't want to make 2 hours on the road driving places, and we wanted a strong school district. We have these beautiful lakefront parks. I think there's a lot we can do to market our community. I know when we were looking at building a house and all sorts of things, and then came here and saw that our kids had sidewalks to walk on. Everybody's got a dog, everybody's got a stroller. There were kids everywhere in the neighborhood. Like, this was like a big factor in why we chose this, in addition to the schools. And I've had conversations over the years personally with people. I talked personally several people into taking their kids from some well-known schools in the area, private schools, and bringing them here, and they didn't realize how many programs we had that really, there was no comparison in the private schools or parochial schools. And when they realized what we had to offer as far as programs, they were just amazed, and they made the switch, and they stayed. So I think those kinds of strategies, if we can get to with community engagement and having conversations and finding a way to have those conversations, because if people don't know, if they're coming from a different area and they come here and they don't, you move in and you don't really understand what is going on in our schools, it's hard to know. And if you've got little kids, you don't really pay attention always to what's at the middle school and the high school. But if you see in some way, oh, this is what my child can do in elementary school, these are all the things we have to offer. Oh, these are all the things we have to offer at the middle school. These are all the things we have to offer at the high school. These are the kids that are going off to college and coming back to the community. Those are the kinds of things I think that really will help us grow back our district and get people, because we know that for a lot of reasons, people left with COVID. A lot of it was out of necessity. They had to work, and the public schools weren't open for a period of time. We lost people. Then they took their kids elsewhere. And as a parent, you're not going to pull your kid out of a school again after they've made friends, after they've made relationships with teachers, and come back that easily. And it wasn't, if you pull one kid, it wasn't just one kid. It was usually more than one kid in a family. So I think those are the kinds of things, making sure that we are making our district really responsive to all of our students, no matter where they come from, no matter what their situations are, that we are making this experience for them just awesome, all the way from our special needs to, the college focus, to a CTE student, to just any child that comes into a classroom, that we make it work. So I think those are the sort of strategies we're talking about.
Okay, and we're going to get into that and some of the other parameters. Mr. Pappas, keep us on target here.
Sorry.
And Mr. Cotton, I'm
Parameter
sorry.
2, student and staff safety. Pursue and propose strategies and anticipated budget impact on measures that will enhance the safety and physical well-being of our students, staff, families, and visitors. Focus shall be on exploring funding options to execute on recommendations from local law enforcement. I have here Trustee Warden, parameter 7, Trustee Pappas, parameter 4, Trustee Jupe, parameter 13. And then I got some feedback after this from Trustee Brumbaugh, if you want to start.
Oh, yeah, my thought with parameter 2 is to expand it because we've used Codentity and another consultant prior to that to give the school district a lot of ideas, some of which have been implemented, some of which could still be considered. So to expand just from saying, hey, explore funding options with local law enforcement, to look at a wide array of partners that the school district has effectively worked with. As I know, we have a robust relationship with our local chiefs of police, but we've had folks come in from, I believe, come to speak to the board from the FBI, talking about training opportunities. As I mentioned, Codentity, some other options like that. So maybe just kind of broaden the language a little bit so it's clear that we kind of want to continue doing those things, not do like a hard pivot to just work with one set of partners.
Okay. Any other comments?
I would just agree with that and add that we want to partner with the building administration as far as what they feel is the most successful for their safety, because I know that for the safety trainings that they do before the school year, the professional development, they've had a lot of input on what has made them feel the most competent and the most secure as far as the active shooter drills and things like that. And they have really good feedback as to what they can do. So taking recommendations from them as far as which resources are the best for their school, especially differing at the high school, middle school, elementary school level. Sometimes it's different.
Thank you. Mr. Cotton, did you grab that one?
I did.
Okay, great. We're on parameter 3.
Pursue and propose community engagement and satisfaction. Pursue and propose strategies and anticipated budget impact responsive to the sentiment of our community stakeholders as expressed in survey instruments and any other structured mechanisms. And I had this as one of Trustee Pappas's point number 22.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Okay, you did, you covered that pretty well. Okay, parameter 4.
Parameter 4, innovative program offerings. Pursue and propose strategies and anticipated budget impact for the district's programmatic offerings that are responsive to market demands. Specifically, explore the district's early education offerings. And so I do see this as also having to deal with CTE. I'm not sure if we want to put that in there specifically or not, but as far as ECE, I have this for Trustee Broombaugh, number 3. Trustee Pappas, number 6, and Trustee Jupe, number 9. As well as if it's CTE, if we're looking at it from that lens, and I think we should, is also Trustee Broombaugh, point number 4, and Trustee Pappas, number 25.
Okay. Anybody else have any other input on that?
I just have a question, Trustee
Go ahead,
Cotton.
Mrs. Worden.
With respect to the exploring the district's early education offerings, I think that's a great idea, but I just wondered if you could give a little bit more detail about what that would entail. Like, would it, I mean, we did I was on a committee with Mr. Chairman last year about the early education committee, and would we sort of expound upon that? Are we going to look into a bond? Like, what sort of things are we going to be doing for the early education offerings?
For me, I think we should have everything on the table. Looking at Plant Moran's proposal, or at least their analysis from last year, they specifically said that early childhood education is one of the best ways to increase enrollment. And my understanding is that committee meeting that you were part of had a lot of different proposals that we may or may not have explored, and we should look back at those. But I think that we should look at early childhood education as a way to expand enrollment, and that it should be something that we really explore.
Can I speak on that briefly?
Go right ahead,
I
briefly.
just very briefly, promise. I just wanted to address the early childhood because it was part of the Plant Moran information we got last year, that the biggest target growth area to bring new people into the district was early childhood. Now, the committee that studied this, one of my concerns at the time when the committee voted to close Trombley and eliminate the youngest levels of early childhood was that it was done right kind of in a really bad time in the heat of the pandemic. And I said at the time, I said, you know, businesses are trying to stay open. They're struggling, and they're struggling with staffing. I mean, we went through it in our family. It was a nightmare. It was not a good time to make a long-reaching decision because everybody was in panic mode. We couldn't get teachers. We couldn't get, and I understand the reasons that they made the decision they did, but I think it was based on temporary information, and I think we're moving into a different place now. So I think coming back now that we are post-pandemic and kind of coming out of that era, there's definitely a market for it, and it definitely was a growth target area in the Plant Moran study. So I think it is definitely something that we need to study very carefully. That's all.
And yeah, I think that if we wanted to look at a proposal for a bond, I think we should explore that.
I think that's a great idea, and I also support the addition of the language for the CTE.
Okay, great. On to parameter 5.
Okay. Staff satisfaction and retention. Pursue and propose strategies and anticipated budget impact that are responsive to our staff and market demands amid rising competition. And I have this for Trustee Warden, parameter 8, and Trustee St. John, parameter 1.
Any other comments or input on that?
Yeah, if this is in relation to the parameters that I submitted, I do want to add again that a multi-year contract I think is very important for the our teachers and staff, just because the industry standard in the area is like 3 or 4 year contracts sometimes. So I think if I know in the past we've kind of done 1 year at a time, and that's kind of exhausting for everyone, and it's just a waste of time and resources to be renegotiating every summer. So if we can, I don't know if we want to explicitly put it in the budget parameters, or if we just want to state as a board that we would like a multi-year contract to be negotiated.
Yeah, that's not something that would really end up in a budget parameter item.
It's been in budget parameters before, so that's why,
Yeah.
because I looked back and found it.
I'd leave that to Dr. Dean, but I don't think it belongs there.
And I've said this for the past several years, I think all of our employee groups and everyone on this stage would like a multi-year agreement.
Okay. Question.
I think everyone nods their head at that one, and I'm even looking at Mrs. Shelson, and she nods her head at that one. At the same time, I'm always of the opinion the place to resolve that is at the bargaining table. And I've always been, and Mrs. Warden knows this, I don't support typically putting those in budget parameters because I tend to think they give the parties, it creates expectations. And, you know, we might want a multi-year contract up on this table, but like what we might be offering in a multi-year contract, they might say no thank you to, if that makes some sense. And so I think it creates expectations that I think are better resolved at the bargaining table than up here. Management has lived with that as one in the past. We will live with it again if it's added in the future, but I understand why it would not be in there.
Okay, that makes sense.
I just want to jump in on this real quick. I was very vocal in the last 2 years and on the last contract that the teachers get a multi-year contract. It is the standard in other school districts, and I know personally many teachers who have complained about this in our district and outside of our district that didn't want to come in here because our teachers were bargaining every year. And it's a waste of our money because we're paying lawyers, we're paying people to do the bargaining. It's a tremendous, if anyone sees the amount of hours that go into bargaining contracts, it is a time-intensive procedure. And it puts administration and faculty at odds every year is ridiculous. It sets up a negative year-to-year, back and forth. And it's, like I said, tremendously time-intensive. And I can't imagine being the people that are sitting through all those bargaining sessions because they're giving up tons of their time, usually on their summer. And I think that's important for our teachers' mental health to be not having that hanging over their head year to year. So I'm just going to put it, I very, very strongly encourage us to look for a multi-year contract if at all possible, because it is what other districts are doing, and we are losing out teachers who don't want to come here and go through the year to year. And I know them personally.
And I don't think anybody would be upset for that to be the result. I think that that's something that we'd be happy with. I just think that starting off with a term isn't quite appropriate in the bargaining.
I mean, I agree. Not, it
I
doesn't
have a
necessarily fit in
compromise.
parameters.
So,
Mrs. St. John?
yes, instead of putting, I hear you on putting a specific term in there when negotiations are still yet to be had. So what if we said something about pursuing competitive compensation and benefits packages, or like pursuing negotiations that are competitive for the area? Because I think that's really what we're getting at here, is making sure that our teachers are, and the other staff are compensated in a way that it makes Grosse Pointe look really good compared to other districts in the area, right? Sorry to the other districts in the area, but we want the best teachers to come here. So to try to change the language to say that our package will be, make sure that it's competitive. Does that make sense to kind of
It
put
does.
that language instead of anything specific?
It does. I'll see if
Okay.
I could capture that.
Thanks.
Parameter 6.
Parameter 6, student-to-teacher ratio analysis. Pursue and propose action relative to our staffing levels, relative to the district's mission, as well as the reality of declining enrollment. The board has traditionally received reports on elementary class size data. This should expand to all levels of our offerings. Decision support data should be presented in historical context.
Any comments on that one? Mr. Brumbaugh?
I think the only comment I had was just an asterisk at the middle school and high school level, because I think when we've talked about this issue before, it's not as easy to do those kind of analyses is at the elementary level, because you have some large format classes and some other things that make it difficult. So I think that it's a very interesting discussion to have. I just want to make sure we're not putting an impossible task on administration. I'm sure that there are ways to talk about it, but
We think we have ways to get there.
we just don't want to skew the average by putting band and choir in with, AP calculus. So-
One of the things I appreciate is Mr. Cotton and Mr. Ishmael spoke with Mrs. Matheson at length about these a couple different times, and I think this is something that is doable from an administration's perspective. I believe so.
Thank you.
Okay. Parameter 7, support services cost containment and reduction. Pursue and propose actions relative to expense reductions furthest away from classroom impact. Present to the board by the end of March with alternatives to reduce support services expenditures by $3 million. Administration shall prioritize reductions in expenditures by focusing on purchase services and supplies. And what I'll say, I know that there is some angst around this. Most of the trustees here asked for a 12% or higher fund equity level. And a 12% fund equity level would need to require something around the reduction of around 3 million or more. And what I wanted to capture was, can we do that furthest away from classroom impact? Also, with the idea that even outside of fund equity level, that we need to right-size this budget based on many things, such as Mrs. Matheson's presentation, and that looking at support services is what I believe is the furthest from classroom impact in a lot of ways, especially when you try and look at reducing expenditures by focusing on purchase services and supplies. That's around a $40 million bucket in our budget. I would say there's not necessarily the low-hanging fruit there, the easy reductions, but when you're cutting a budget, it's not always best to go for what is easy to cut. That I do understand that some of this would be harder on the administration to do, but I think that it's important to look into this area, and that I know there's concerns about, do we point to 3 million? Possibly maybe point to a percentage and see if we could do a 10% cut. I mean, you're basically around the same place or a little higher, but focusing in this area I think is pretty important. And
I'll give a little background on that from old man's standpoint. When we used to do budget development back in the, when we had the really tough times here, we had 05, 06 were tough years. And one of the things that the administration did routinely, and that we would get, it was a great tool, was a list of potential cuts, and they were prioritized. And it was a great tool to look at it, so that we all sort of agreed on, okay, we've got a list here of $3 million of potential cuts. If we only need to cut 2.5, then the administration knows which items on that list we've agreed to. And I think it's a good, if not, it's a great exercise too for this board to go through to see what some of these items cost. Because I mean, simple things like changing class size by 1 can be, wasn't that somewhere close to $900,000? It was, I remember back, the numbers were staggering. And I think it's a good exercise for us to go through, and I think it's a reality check. Mrs. St. John.
So my question is, why are we putting a $3 million number on it when we don't necessarily, like, we don't even have the correct report? We don't necessarily know the revenue that's coming in, so we don't know how much we need to cut. I'm totally fine with keeping it as this is where we would like to look first. If you have to make cuts, make it from non-instructional support services, which I believe I emailed you, Mr. Cotton, the language that I think would be better. But putting an exact dollar amount seems too prescriptive when we don't know what our budget's going to look like yet, because we don't, I mean, we have to put these parameters and then 6 months later make the budget, and then the state doesn't even give us our money for 3 more months. We know that it's a difficult timeline to work with, but I don't want to put our administration in a bind by setting these arbitrary numbers when we aren't sure that that's the number that they'll need to cut.
It's a place to start based on everybody's desire to be at 12%, is the way I look at it. Mr. Brumbaugh.
I think you're right that we all want to get to a point where we're growing fund equity. But one of the discussions that you and I had, President Ismail, is kind of setting a realistic target for this year and having kind of a glide path,
Right.
To getting to a 12 to 15% fund equity target. And because I think it's important to kind of have a realistic expectation of where we're going to go, and part of that is what Trustee St. John mentioned about knowing what the CREC looks like, knowing what Lansing may give us in terms of increased foundation allowance or other categoricals. And I don't know, to me, my concern with this was it might be based on, like I think Trustee Cotton mentioned that we want to keep away from the classroom, which is right.
As much as possible.
But some of the expenses that go into that bucket are things that either directly support or impact the classroom, and I think you really have to get into the details of it to kind of see where things kind of land. So I think, like you had
And I
mentioned,
think the
with
administration will do a great job of guiding us there.
Oh yeah, I think, and in terms of the budget management utility that you mentioned, I think that kind of probably provided a little more detail on some of those items of discussion. But if these cuts would be better spread out across other business units, or there are efficiencies that we can obtain more easily to cut expenses, or if we have unfilled vacancies, personnel that depart the district and don't need to be replaced. There are other ways to achieve, cost reduction targets without saying a specific dollar amount in a specific business unit. So that was kind of my thought on that, is having kind of a target to get to a particular fund equity level, or to stabilize and grow the fund equity over a period of time might be a better way to frame that, and then kind of have a discussion with administration over the next couple months as to where they think that might come out of, and then getting into some level of detail like you were talking about to kind of talk about where those should best land, versus saying $3 million specifically from that business unit.
I would say, maybe we could put some kind of prioritization list, but the things that you're bringing up as well, I do believe we need to take those into account. I think $3 million is almost an at least. This entire budget parameter resolution needs to be around the idea that we need to right-size this budget now, and especially in anticipation of what's coming down the pipeline, and that, sort of like, I understand the smoothing out the flight path that you're talking about, but I think it needs to not be this year, it needs to be taken into account the next 3 years, because we have those issues coming, and that this is almost, I expect us to have more than this in terms of cuts if we take into all these, account all these budget parameters, and then hopefully take a look at how we interact with parameter 13, which is having that zero-based budget where we're spending all of the revenue that we're taking in. I want to look at how we can get to that as soon as possible. I could see where maybe it's a year and a half or something like that to get there, but we need to take that into account now and take a really hard look at this because of our current trajectory with our budget, which was presented by Mrs. Matheson.
Mrs. Matheson, let me ask you a question. You were raising your hand, so you go ahead and speak first.
Do you want to ask your question first?
Well, my question is, does the $3 million create angst for you as far as at least preparing a list for us and giving us a picture of what that means?
So $3 million on our total budget is not a concern to me. I agree it's going to be a challenge, and people somewhere, somehow will feel some pain through this, right? Because $3 million is still a large amount of money. But I support your direction on the $3 million reduction. I do think $3 million reduction from purchase services, materials, and supplies could be challenging. One point of clarification I wanted to make is that the $40 million that Treasurer Cotton had mentioned is not $40 million in our budget specifically in purchase services and supplies and materials. Right. That is the dollar amount that is within our instructional support services and non-instructional support services. So that was one piece that I wanted to clarify. It's about $15 million that is purchase services throughout our budget. Another piece also, just as a point of conversation, is something such as transportation. That's 1.6 million that is all in purchase services because we contract.
Right.
Our utilities are going to be in that purchase service supply type area in terms of account coding. That's another $2 million that, I mean, we can work on some energy efficiency things, but we can't, cut an exact amount from there. And then one other thing that I just wanted to share, because I've heard some comments from community members concerned that support services equates to special education, and I wanted to bring clarity around that. Special education is actually accounted for under the instructional services line item called added needs.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure that everybody
Thank you for
was
doing
on the
that.
same
Thank you.
understanding of what support services means.
Dr. Dean?
Just one other point of clarity, and part of this is, there aren't, even amongst our returning board members, outside of Mr. Ishmael, I don't know, and Mrs. Matheson, we've only ones sitting on the stage when we're in budget cutting mode, like big budget cutting mode over time. And typically what happens when you do that is you do come up with like a list or a menu or whatever words we want to use to describe. And we talk through that, frankly, in March. Because many of those decisions, like you have to have a prioritized list. You might not find out about revenue until May, but you've got different things. I mean, let's be fair. Almost all the dollars we spend in this district, 85 to 90% are people. So if you're going to be losing significant dollars, you're going to be losing people. I mean, most likely. I agree, we'll be as far from the classroom as possible. There's all those sorts of pieces, but you need to be making those decisions even before the final budget adoption in June.
Exactly.
And so when you finally get this state aid is this, you might make different decisions from the menu. But that's the work, and what I've envisioned happening is Mrs. Matheson, working with Dr. Bishop and I, will be leading an internal administrator like prioritization, digging through all those sorts of things, partnering with the finance committee. And in March, late March, we're going to be coming back and kind of in public saying, hey, here's this list. Some of these will be things the board will look at and immediately go, no way, this doesn't work, right? And that's okay, all right? Some of these will be things like, oh, this makes good sense, okay? And we'll work our way through that, and that's that balancing piece. I mean, part I appreciate about this, and I completely agree with this, is the idea of keeping it as far from the classroom as possible. Everything matters for kids in this district, all $100 million of our budget, but ways that we can prioritize keeping that far from kids, recognizing, as Mrs. Matheson said, there's some stuff that we can't touch because like it's a mandate we have to do. Do you know what I'm saying? And I know everyone up here knows that. So I appreciate the flexibility to let us kind of do that work, dig into it, and then provide regular updates back to the board. So I'm comfortable with where we can get to with that.
Great. Thank you.
And I do want to clarify that I view this as looking at support services first, that $40 million, and then prioritizing within there as much as possible the purchase services and supplies. And so if I could write that clearer, I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Mrs.
So
St. John?
I have a question on the budget, just the idea of budget parameters as a new board member, I guess. My concern with the actual dollar amount is not, I'm happy to set that goal and say we want to look to these, the non-instructional support services and purchase services first. My concern about the dollar amount is, it's in our bylaws that we need to allow for flexibility in the administration's approach to budget development, and I don't want to be tying Ms. Matheson's hands while she tries to find $3 million from just this one category, and she can't find another cent, but she knows that, there's $500,000 over in another category that we could probably do away with or something. I want her to have that flexibility when creating this priority list, but still look to what we have identified as the priority for cuts. Does that make sense?
I think it does. I think, though, that we do want everything here in Grosse Pointe, but right now we don't have the revenue to pay for everything. If that changes, then all we had was a plan to cut, and that doesn't mean that we cut anything, is my understanding.
Right.
And so coming up with that plan, because I don't want to have it where we could have planned for the next 3 or 4 months and suddenly, okay, great, the legislature, the governor came up with enough money for us to pay for everything, but we're now behind in our planning. And so we need to plan now because we don't have enough money coming into the system to pay for everything. And if we continue on that, then we will have a fund equity level that requires drastic measures, and I don't want to be there. And not planning for that, I think, is imprudent.
Well, I think, Mrs. Matheson, are you comfortable with the direction as it's written?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing that there is flexibility. There's a request to prioritize looking at support
Exactly.
service areas as well as purchase services, materials and supplies. We will absolutely dig into there as long as everybody's understanding. If we come back and say, okay, we could only get to, I'm making it up, 1.6 million. I don't know what the number
Sure.
will be, and we found some other things in other areas. So we'll certainly start looking there to begin with, and the 3 million number overall as being eliminated from our budget doesn't cause me as much concern as trying to find it specifically in purchase services and supplies.
Thank you.
I guess that's my question about the budget parameters by saying the 3 million in this specific thing, is that just a suggestion, or is that something we would have to, once we approve it at the next meeting, now we've said it and we have to stick to it?
These are parameters.
Parameters are just.
These are parameters.
There's
They're not-
suggestions to Ms. Matheson,
Right.
and if she comes back and says, this is a better way, and we agree that it's better to cut from here, we can all adjust it, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm comfortable with that then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just,
Mr. Brumbaugh.
and I just also, like Trustee Cotton said to your question, Trustee St. John, if it looks like we are in a much better financial position and we don't have to cut as much, that's great. And if the worst happens, then we have to revisit the question. But I also wanted to thank Trustee Cotton for bringing up the idea of looking at this question in a multi-year basis, because I think sometimes you can make, if you go, hey, we're going to look at the next 6 months, the next 12 months, you can kind of make little cuts here and there that accumulate over the course of decades, and then you end up with outcomes that you would not have chosen if you didn't start out with a plan in mind. So I think when we talk about changes and cuts, taking a longer term optic and being mindful of the uncertainty that comes along with that, but thinking about where we want the district to be over a longer term period of time is a much more responsible way to think about these questions. So thank you for highlighting that.
Mrs. Pappas.
Okay, I've waited a long time because I kept passed back and over. Well, I ceded my time that way, and I kept
You've
forgetting.
got 3 minutes. Go for it.
I'll be brief. Just one thing, I was a community member with young kids here when you were on the board back in that budget cutting time. And of all the board trustees through the years, it was Trustee Ishmael that was very transparent to the community about, and those lists that they were talking about, prioritizing cuts. Literally itemized list of this is what this costs, this is what this costs, and all sorts of different categories. It is really, this is a proactive approach to budgeting as opposed to a reactive approach. Because a lot of things, when you get into a panic that, we don't have enough money and we're running out, then all of a sudden you're making very sudden cuts, poor decision-making when you're doing things in a short term. It is absolutely, especially with a lot of the economic forecasts right now, to be proactive. And quite frankly, everything I've seen on these budget numbers, 3 million is not going to right-size the ship. It's a good target right now. I think I've seen numbers like 4.8, things like that. If this economy continues to go in this direction, we won't be the only district looking at this. But we have to look ahead and plan ahead. It would be irresponsible not to. And I look at it as hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. And if we do that, we're not getting hit by last-minute surprises, and we're not going to be making last-minute, usually poor and reactive decisions. This is a proactive approach to budgeting.
Thank you. Mr. Cotton.
Parameter 8, healthcare cost containment. Pursue and propose an action plan responsive to the district's healthcare costs. Present to the board 2024 healthcare cost projections and alternatives for cost containment and reduction. What I'd like to say here is that healthcare is incredibly personal to everybody. It's something that is hard to make changes. And I think that, our first thought is not to make any changes, but to look at plans that would be keep the same benefit. But if there are areas to cut those costs, then look to that, whether it's insurance broker or any other kinds of options, knowing that this is a very hard one, especially there's a lot of emotions tied up in healthcare.
Any comments on that item?
I just have a couple comments. So it's
Mrs.
my
Warden.
understanding that, I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. that we are self-insured, so what would be the alternative plans, like going to like a Blue Cross type situation? Like, what is the suggestion in the healthcare cost containment?
That's a,
Do you want me to take a stab at that one?
go right ahead.
In talking to Mr. Cotton and Mr. Ishmael, and we do this on a regular basis anyway, we need to sit down with Gallagher, who's our third-party administrator, to have conversations. For clarity, we already have Blue Cross. You know what I'm saying? We have a Blue Cross PPO one.
Right.
Having conversations with them, we know that all of our insurance coverages are bargained with all 5 of our collective bargaining groups. But it's just going in and having the conversation. Sometimes there's things in that industry I've found, whether it's around your stop loss or it's around, are you self-funded? Like, we're self-funded for workers' comp. Maybe the decision is you shouldn't be self-funded for workers' comp. Maybe we need to become fully insured for that. Just having those conversations and digging in. This, to me, is one of those longer-term budget parameters, because the odds of making changes for our plan, for our plan year, some of our plan years start in April, is limited, okay? But I think it's a good target to have conversations. To have that conversations as we're heading into bargaining also makes some sense. But as Mr. Cotton said, health insurance is personal. We are self-funded. So obviously, if we were looking to reduce benefit levels, that's a challenge, and that's not what people are advocating for, I don't believe. But we're looking at how do we dig in? Is there different ways we could be doing, and maybe more innovative ways we could be doing some things? Did I get close, Mr. Cotton?
Yes, yes.
It's due diligence.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other comments on parameter 8? Going once, twice. Mr. Cotton, on to parameter 9.
Forecast and budget accuracy. Pursue the development of monthly reports that provide the board a view on month-to-date actual performance versus the budget. With district operating losses nearing $9 million over the last 2 years, the margin for error decreases. Maintain a proactive line of communication with the board when new information becomes available that impacts the budget. And this was Trustee Jupe, number 8.
Okay, any comments on that? Mr. Brumbaugh, I see your brain churning.
Thank you, sir. I know that one of the challenges for doing kind of more regular projections is that the data does not come in necessarily on a weekly, monthly basis. Do we have a sense as to, I don't know if Trustee Jupe wanted to speak to this, or Trustee Cotton, like what that update would look like? Is it just like a general azimuth check? Yeah, nothing significant has changed over the last month. We're going in the right direction for those months where we don't have a significant update, or and then in the months where we do, we get the CREC, we get something else coming in, and we have a bigger update, or did you have something more specific in mind in terms of what you wanted to see on a month-to-month basis?
Well, I did speak to Mrs. Matheson about this, and I'm not sure if you put any thought to what would increase that line of communication.
I guess my initial thought was that we would probably have some conversations around this at the Finance and Facilities Committee meeting. I have seen in the past where board members have, seen other types of financial reports that are provided to boards of other districts that they tend to like. And what we do provide for you now is what comes directly out of our software. So anything, I shouldn't say anything else, but a lot of other types of reports would be something that I would have to export data, do my own pivot tables and things to summarize, and then put on an Excel document, turn it into a PDF to make it look like a report for you. I'm not opposed to doing those things. I think we just need to figure out what the committee feels would be useful and beneficial to look at on I'm going to say month to month, but whatever frequency, quite honestly, as well, that you would be interested in seeing something. I'm quite happy to share more reports and do additional financial presentations for the board as requested.
Thank you. Anybody else on that item?
Okay, parameter 10, anticipate federal aid reduction, avoid any unanticipated impact of reduction or elimination of expiring financial aid, especially federal COVID funds. Propose a report component within the monthly financial update that anticipates the board's and taxpayer interest as these aid packages wind down and expire. I have this Trustee Pappas 14, Trustee Jupe 3 and 4.
Any comments on that item? Going once, going twice. Mr. Brumbaugh, I see you churning again.
Was this addressed by slide 8 in the budget presentation where it talks about all of the different, 15 COVID line items and kind of how they fall off over time? Or did you see something more detail?
I see creating a budget that takes into account that we have cuts that we may need to make because of that we need to anticipate that we're going to have less money coming into the district, and to do that as soon as possible so that we smooth out that flight path.
So something along the lines of what we see in the Human Resources report when we talk about, this person replaced somebody who resigned, or this is a new position, something like that, where things that are funded with that money are flagged, or something more detailed than that?
I think that, I look at this COVID, everybody looks at the COVID money differently, but we're going to have less money coming in. And if that's, I don't know if you're recommending that anything that is associated with those COVID funds is just cut the second it's gone, or it's cut at that time. But I just think for me, it's an overall budget, looking at the budget, saying we're going to have less money coming in, we have to take that into account.
Yeah. No, I'm not suggesting anything, just seeking to understand kind of the parameters of what we're trying to get here. Because obviously some things that we've spent COVID money on have been, hey, let's try this thing out, and it might be a thing that has worked and that we want to continue even after that funding stream ends. We can transition to a categorical funding stream or to a general fund piece. So I wouldn't say, first in, first out.
I don't mean to interrupt, Mr. Codd, but I would see that sort of dovetails into the wish list / hit list that the administration develops, as far as here's the priorities of what we want to maintain, and some of those items that are COVID funded may very well supplant items that we're doing now.
Agreed.
Out of non-COVID money.
Agreed.
And I'm leaving that to the administration to bring us those suggestions. I don't pretend to know what those are, and I just want them, the pre-planning is what's important to me, that we're not waiting until COVID money's gone and say, oh, wow, what should we do now? No. And that was at least my intent with the verbiages there.
I think that some of that has been part of discussions we've had before, and I completely agree that should continue to be part of the budgeting process.
Mrs. Pappas?
Just a brief comment. One of the concerns some of us voiced when, the COVID money came in was that we wanted it in a separate bucket, not being used to offset other costs. And then, there were positions that were created with COVID money that was only fully funded with COVID money like the first year, and then each year thereafter, the district had to pick up 40% and then 60%, and then eventually fully fund the positions that were created. And, I had concerns at the time. It's not that you don't want to create those positions to meet a need. There's these funds to use, but it's not just free money. If it was going to be funded indefinitely, there's a different conversation. But it's hard to bring people into the district and create, them as part of the framework, and then a year or two later say, bye-bye, we can't afford you anymore. And that creates a lot of, people build relationships with our students, and that was one of my concerns, was that we were using short-term money to fund a long-term set of positions that we weren't going to be able to sustain financially. So that was one of my concerns at the time. And I just want to point out that grant money and free money is not always, and actually very seldom, free. You get money, and then if there are strings and expenses associated with that free money over a long term, it's not free. It's still costing the district money, and it might be a worthy thing. But I just want to make that clear, that
Thank you.
it's, anxious to jump for free money. You've got to think about it.
Okay, next item.
Parameter 11, class size standards, avoid deviation from the district's longstanding class size guidelines. And I have this as trustee Warden number 4 and trustee Broombaugh number 5.
Dr. Dean, just for the viewing audience, can you explain what our current class size?
They exist, young 5s through 4th grade. Young 5s in kindergarten is 24. Grades 2 through 4, it is 27 students.
Right. And so beyond that?
When we get to a situation beyond that, we have a variety of tools in place. One is the concept of, if you enroll your child after May 1st and there's no room, they'll move for 1 year to another spot.
Got it.
We also sometimes will open another section if necessary, or we might hire a paraprofessional on a short-term basis or something along those lines. We address each of those individually.
Great.
This has been in place since before I got here. those numbers are unchanged, and I fully support maintaining them. That makes perfect sense.
Great. Any comments on that item? Okay, Mr. Cotton, and I wanted to preface, I apologize, I wanted to announce at the meeting, we're going to take a 10-minute break at 9 o'clock. So we'll finish up the parameters, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll continue on. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
All right, parameter 12, employee contracts. Pursue active engagement with employee bargaining units relative to future agreements that equitably serve the needs of staff, students, and taxpayers. Avoid reliance on employee contract elements that reduce staff compensation.
Any comments on that item?
And I think that's apparent that what we're talking about is the formula that is in the teacher's contract. And what we'd like to do is try and figure out how we could do a new contract while avoiding any reliance on that.
Okay. Parameter 13?
Could I just ask a question?
Well, I'm sorry. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
thank you. So, just so I understand, are we trying to then put into our parameter 12 language that would get rid of the formula?
No.
No, I don't know. I think that what we're trying to do is that's with this budget overall, and I think it mostly ties to the next parameter where, I think it ties to the next parameter where we're not shooting for a fund equity level, and that's where you really see that formula kick in, and that we don't want to have a budget that's designed where it's relying on the employee contract formula to kick into, if that makes sense.
Yes, so then with parameter 13, we would not have a budget fund equity target then?
Correct.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding. It sounds like we don't want the formula anymore.
Well, that's a subject of negotiation. I
Yeah.
don't think.
Yeah, I would say that's part of a negotiation with the teacher's
Okay,
contract.
so
I'm just, with
I
this,
thought
and
that's
maybe
what
I
I
can
heard
make it
you say.
clear, I don't want to, I mean, we are having changes to our budget based on all these parameters working together. But the last thing I want, and I mean, it could be something that we say, is we'll drop fund equity level to X, and that's going to kick in the formula, and we could cut costs there. We are absolutely not trying to do that. I am. I'm trying to, everything that everybody here has proposed didn't take that into account. However, if you look at general fund equity level parameters, we don't have a target. And so how about I just read that one and then we go into that? All right, general fund equity levels, parameter 13. Avoid disproportionate adherence to arbitrary general fund equity levels that threaten the primary mission of the Grosse Pointe Public School System. The board will not prescribe a specific general fund equity target, but will demand accountability and transparency relative to budget targets which themselves are an agreement among the board, the administration, and the taxpayers. Preference is that the administration prepares a budget where the expenses are equal to the revenues for the 2023-2024 fiscal year, that is, operate on a balanced budget. I think that the importance of that is, one, we're in a belt-tightening times. We have to make cuts. We absolutely have to in order for this system to be fiscally sound. The idea that we're going to do that and then not spend almost every dollar that we bring in, that we start saying, okay, we need to build this money up, I don't think that we even have that ability. And so this recognizes that. But I also want to make sure that as we build this budget, and I think that that last part is that this is an agreement with the board, the administration, the taxpayers, that we're not doing that on the backs of the teachers. Or trying to keep the cuts from our system as much as possible, because we do want everything we have. We want more than what we have, but at this time, I don't see how we could have everything that we have today and continue on this trajectory. If we can, especially based on things that happen at the state, if we, can make prudent cuts, if we could find ways to make those cuts and not impact our offerings, and that's fantastic. But we are in some times where we have to make cuts.
Any clarification or items on that?
So if I understand correctly, if there's an equation here, we're focusing on, say, the left side of the equation where you're looking at income and expenses and not the right side of the equation where we'd look at what the kind of fund equity piece coming out of it would be, not to oversimplify that. But that's the idea, is that you would almost look for a neutral outcome in terms of income and expenses and not focus so much on getting fund equity to a particular target.
Yes, and to look at the current amount of money that we have put away in the fund equity is hopefully we're able to maintain that.
Mrs. Matheson, is there anything that you see here that gives you pause or that is going to create a burp in your day?
No, Treasurer Cotton had taken the opportunity to meet with Dr. Dean and myself, and we appreciated that time together. We had an opportunity to provide some feedback that he took into consideration, and I think these,
You're
take a lot.
comfortable with where we're at here?
Yeah, it takes a lot of that into consideration, so thank you for doing that with us.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Great. Any other comments on the budget parameters? Now, we are not voting on this until February 13th, is it? Okay. But I know in the meantime, you're doing work based on the comments that you heard tonight, and so that's where we're at on the budget parameters. We're going to take any other comments on the budget parameters before we move forward?
I will just say that I'm going to try and take into account the comments today and try and work on that as soon as possible, because I think all of us want to make sure that Mrs. Matheson has all of our information. And if anybody could send me any further comments, if they have any after this, that'd be fantastic.
Well, I want to thank you for the time you put into this, Treasurer Cotton. You did a great job. I've looked at a lot of these over the years, and you've covered a lot of bases. I appreciate the time you spent with Mrs. Matheson and Dr. Dean, and I know you've been working overtime on this and trying to get everybody's input in here and come up with something that's cohesive that gives us a roadmap on where we're going budget-wise, not only for this year, but for future years, and I appreciate it. Thank you. With that, we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at, it's 8:56, so where does that take us?
9:06.
9:06. We will be back. Thank you. Okay, folks, we're going to get started up again. Our next item is item 6.2, approval of board legal counsel. And Trustee Cotton, I guess that's yours again.
Yes. So I apologize, I don't have this for the site for posted today. Just finished most of it. Can this get uploaded tomorrow, Dr. Dean? Okay, I'll pass this out in a second. I just want to say, so legal counsel is not just to protect a board. It's there to advise a board, to help guide a board in decisions. This legal counsel is not meant to act as the attorneys for any one board member. Any board member that acted grossly negligent or stepped outside their duties as a board member would not be defended by our attorneys. The way of our system of governance that the school board is set up, and this isn't anything to do with the current administration, it has nothing to do with the current council, this has nothing to do with any suspicions of anything, but there is not really independence of the board from the administrators of the school district. It is not designed through ill intent on the part of anyone or any organization. It appears to be really a default of a lot of school systems. That I believe in order to effectively exercise our fiduciary duties and provide good governance through internal controls and standards of ethics through reporting requirements, the independent directors of the school board should have access to independent legal counsel for specific legal questions. That the idea of independent legal counsel stems from the fact that a general counsel of an organization is usually intimately involved with the management of a company and many of the day-to-day issues of operations. That for our school system, our current legal counsel, which is one of the most respected law firms in the state by me and others, both of them, both Clark Hill and Miller, Canfield, Paddock and Stone, but they're intimately involved with the administration. That prudent and good governance has some additional costs associated with it. I looked through the last 2 years of memos for legal costs, and I saw about $50,000 worth of legal costs from the prior year that I think would go towards some kind of independent legal counsel, and about $5,000 from just last year. And I think those incremental costs are to avoid what could be larger issues. Most of the costs of getting additional reporting would be on the backs of administration and from those volunteers at the committee level, though their time on the board is thankfully free. Some costs may be incurred, but I would think minimal. I reached out to 5 of the top law firms that are members of the Michigan Council of School Attorneys to respond to this board's request for engagement, and all responded. I will be circulating those responses to the board members here this week. I also talked to our current legal counsel. He understood what we're doing. He respected this position. So.
Trustee Worden.
Yes, I have a couple concerns, and then I have a couple questions. My concern is that when you look at the attorney-client relationship with the district and with our attorneys, we as the board are the client here. So I'm just trying to figure out a situation where the interests of the school board and the interests of the district are different. And if we can't answer that question, I don't know why we need another attorney. And that's one of the questions I have. The other question I have is, I'd like to know in what circumstance would it be necessary to have separate counsel? Like in what circumstance are we going to say, all right, we have to consult an outside counsel? Because again, we are the client here. In a attorney-client relationship, the school board is the client, not John Dean, not the administration, not Dr. Bishop, not Amanda Matheson, it's us. So for instance, if we were negotiating the superintendent's contract and the superintendent said, listen, I want you to put an extra 30 grand in this contract, that attorney would be required to come to us and say, listen, school board, you're my client. He's trying to put something else in the contract that doesn't look like it's in the best interest of the board. So I'm just trying to figure out in what situation our own attorneys, Miller, Canfield, and Clark Hill, would not be looking out for the best interests of the board. That's my first question. The other question I have is, because the board acts as a whole and because individual board members have no power except as the whole when we're convened at the board, how would the board work with this separate counsel? That's my second question. My third question is, will there be an RFP that's put out to get this new law firm? And then my next question is,
Oh, you're going a little fast for me. I'm trying to write
sorry.
these down.
I can
Okay.
send these to you,
That would be great.
Chairman, too. Yeah, I'm happy to send this to you in an email to the entire board. My next question, who would be the contact through the board? I know that our bylaws say that the president and the superintendent could reach out to this attorney, but I think I said this at another meeting, you can't really pick up the phone and call an attorney without spending, a substantial amount of money. Or, for instance, if we had a legal question that we felt that our own attorneys weren't going to answer for us, I mean, a legal opinion could cost, a couple grand. So I'm guessing, like, who would decide if we're going to spend the money? Because, again, individual board members have no power on their own. So these are some of the questions I have. But I guess the initial question I would like answered is, in what circumstance would we need separate counsel? Because our attorneys right now we are the client. So in what circumstance?
Well, I think probably the proper thing to do, in all fairness to Mr. Cotton, is why don't we go through his proposal and let's see if that answers any of these questions. Let's go through not his parameters, but his motion that he's made up, and let's see if that answers any of the questions. And then we'll go beyond, and if it doesn't answer them, then we'll go and find those answers.
Yes, they'll be uploaded to the website tomorrow. Okay, engagement of independent legal counsel. And also, I attached a few articles I found online that have to do with independent directors and, in some cases, independent counsel. Okay, engagement of independent legal counsel, preamble. A resolution to engage an independent law firm to provide legal counsel directly to the Grosse Pointe Public School System Board of Education, the board. Background. Whereas in the early years of this century, organizations were plagued with scandals that resulted from poor oversight and governance, specifically the scandals surrounding Arthur Andersen, Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom. Whereas it was determined by experts in governance and in government that independent directors, due to their unique position as independent from management and day-to-day operations, must have a larger voice in an organization. Whereas the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was enacted in response to the scandals and pursuant to advice from governance experts and along with the rules of the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange, mandated that publicly traded companies increase the number of independent directors and independent committees at the highest governance levels, the board of directors. Whereas SOX recognized that independent directors as fiduciaries and independent committees as integral to independent oversight must have access to independent legal counsel in order for them to exercise their fiduciary duties. Whereas a person who holds a legal position of confidence and trust on behalf of an organization is known as a fiduciary, whereas the law imposes the highest standards of care and law on a fiduciary in the exercise of their judgment on behalf of their beneficiary organization. Whereas the use of independent directors has been acknowledged to be best practice for highly effective governance beyond publicly traded companies, and their use has increased in privately held corporations, nonprofit organizations, and other highly effective organizations in the U.S., Canada, Europe, and Japan. Whereas those best practices that deal with internal controls and director independence urged independent directors and independent committees to seek the advice of independent legal counsel in the exercise of their fiduciary duties. Whereas the members of the board have been entrusted by the residents of the Grosse Pointe Public School System to act as independent trustees invested with fiduciary duties to provide oversight of the system. Whereas the board creates and sets the policy of the system and the administration executes on that policy. Whereas under the current governance model of the system, there is no independence of the board from the administration, as all questions by the members of the board must go through the administration. Whereas the prudent governance of an organization is measured by the independence of its fiduciaries in order for them to properly exercise their duties of care, loyalty, and good faith, and whereas it is concluded that in order for a member of the board to exercise their fiduciary duties, they must have access to sound and independent legal advice in order for the member of the board to exercise their duty of care and their duty of good faith. Council engagement procedures. Board members and committees shall petition the president to seek legal advice on specific legal matters from sound and independent legal counsel. The president shall, if advice is needed, direct independent legal counsel to research and provide advice on those specific legal matters. Request that the board engage law firm to be placed here as independent legal counsel.
Ms. St. John.
So my question about the resolution, it says, just for anyone who didn't catch it the first time, board members and committees shall petition the president to seek legal advice on specific legal matters from sound and independent legal counsel. And it sounds like that's what we can already do. We can ask President Ismail to ask our current legal representatives, or have John Dean ask our current legal representatives any question that we might have. For example, we had a question about when it was legal to use sinking funds. We asked whichever legal counsel was most experienced on that issue, and that's the beauty of having access to many legal counsels with the district, is we went with the experts on this instead of just one lawyer. So is the concern that we have to ask the superintendent to ask the lawyer? Is that what we're trying to get away from? We want to be able to ask the lawyer directly? Is that how this resolution is different from our current operating procedure?
That would be one of them. I'm not sure that we wouldn't have gone with the exact same counsel in that situation. I'm not sure if that is exactly what would be something at the board level. But no, Miller Canfield would not, in my mind, be considered independent legal counsel.
Okay, so I'm still confused then about what the resolution is. If we are saying that we're going to ask independent legal counsel when we have a question, how is that different from what we do now? We just want to ask, we don't want to have to ask the superintendent first. We want to be able to ask an independent legal counsel directly, is what makes it different?
Yeah, I would say that I think you have it nailed there.
Okay, so my concern there would be that a lot of things would get duplicated. So just as to use the previous week as an example, we have concerns about what's a legal use of sinking funds. We ask our independent legal counsel, and they bill the district. John Dean has the same concerns, or Ms. Matheson also has the same question because the community's been asking her about the use of sinking funds. They ask their legal counsel. Now we have two separate lawyers billing to answer the same question and probably come up with the same answer because the law is the law. So my concern is that we're going to be asking the same questions just separately as a board to get the same or very similar answers, and thus duplicating all these legal expenses is there a cap on it? How much we can spend to get the same answers that the administration can get from their legal counsel?
I would not expect there to be a time when the administration asks for a legal opinion and the board asks for the same legal opinion.
How are we
I think
going to
that'd be very duplicative. How would we know what?
How would we know that they haven't already asked that question if we're not communicating, if we're having our own separate legal counsel now?
We would just ask them.
Talk to them. Mrs. Pappas?
I just want to comment that there was a very serious legal issue that came up on the previous board, and our legal counsel advised a certain line of action. Not only was that legal opinion, to me, very short-sighted because it only presented option A, where a legal counsel doing due diligence should say, if you pursue A, this might be the outcome. If you pursue B, this might be some more comprehensive opinion. And what was amazing to me was that I was at MASB and talked to our MASB expert in person at the end of a school law session at that conference, and he admitted to me, I questioned him on the legal opinion that our firm had given, and he admitted to me, well, there are other attorneys that do agree with your opinion on this. And I had a huge problem with the fact that our counsel was part of a firm that was representing an entity on the same issue, and they were actually representing the Oakland County Health Department at that point, and it was a conflict of interest. I don't care how big the firm is, it was absolutely a conflict of interest. Yet all we had to go was through our board attorneys, and that was my personal experience having to deal with school law. There's different opinions. There's different opinions, and sometimes we might want to seek something different than what our district, it's not a duplicative thing. It should be one more voice in the bucket, that's all.
And what's interesting to me is that Mr. McInerney, I met with him today, and he very much understands this. He was very, we basically explained to him the concerns that we had, and he was good with it. I mean, he's a good attorney. Nobody's slamming Clark Hill, or nobody's saying, hey, they're not good people, but there's some people, that you may want to consult on certain issues, and you may want to consult independently of the person that's doing the work for the school system. Mrs. Worden.
Well, my concern, though, is I'm just looking at this for the first time, but this whole entire resolution is based upon this Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is really dealing with federal securities law and the banking industry. And I understand that it mentions fiduciary, but the thing is the fiduciary relationship, as I said earlier, is between the school board and our attorney. So I guess I'm concerned that we are going to be hiring another firm, and we're essentially just opinion shopping. If we have a law firm that already represents our interests, I don't understand why we need another firm, which will obviously cost more money, to get another opinion. I mean, we're essentially asking two different firms to look out for the best interests of the board, and I guess I can't comprehend that.
Okay.
Because it seems like this isn't really looking at what the attorney-client relationship is.
Thank you.
And so I guess, and the other, my number one question is, and Mr. Ismail, I will absolutely email you these questions, but what would be an instance where we would need a separate law firm to look out for our best interest?
For me, I would say one of them is changing the bylaws, looking at the policies, policy review, bylaw review. Those are the policies of the board. And so in looking at the legal memo for expenses, 2021, 2022, I think it was around $50,000 for that. And I wouldn't expect a new law firm to cost any more for the exact same exercise. But I mean, for me, that'd be one of them, is looking at the policies.
Well, I think
Those are
that-
all, and
I think-
opinion shopping, I mean, I don't think that's really what is contemplated under this. It's more looking at specific legal advice for the board, and only going to one place for that.
And just for context on that particular bill, it was that the district had decided to go from working with Neola, which is a national policy advisor that partners, I believe, with Thrun, which is another big school law firm in the state, to do like a sanity check on the model policies they provide. And then we paid Clark Hill to go through with us, and this is over the course of many, many years, to essentially recheck everything against the gross points, kind of idiosyncratic policies and expectations when it came to the policy manual. So that particular bill isn't a recurring expense. It's something that came from a board decision to say, hey, we can get a better tailored, easier to understand policy manual by just working directly with Clark Hill, as opposed to having Clark Hill copy edit some of the more lengthier than necessary, initial model policies provided by Neola. So
No,
I think
I
you're right.
would
You
agree.
could have partnered with Thrun or Miller Canfield or somebody else to do that same exercise, but it was Clark Hill's experience kind of writing a lot of the, like the enrollment policy and some of the other, grading policies, with the policy committee, writing some of those more idiosyncratic gross point policies that caused the board at the time to decide to partner with them, just because they had the depth of expertise in kind of the gross point piece. So
Right.
it's a asterisk, I guess, on that particular expense.
And I could agree with that. I'm just pointing out what out of a $250,000 budget, I would see. Everything else looked to me like operational, day-to-day legal questions that were with Clark Hill. Employment matters, student matters. I mean, all of that is day-to-day general counsel work.
I have one more follow-up question, or actually comment, and I think Mr. Brumbaugh mentioned this earlier, but I did speak with the attorney at MASB today, and he told me that he knows of no other instance where this has ever happened. So I'm just concerned that we are doing something that no other school district does, and I still don't feel like I have a good reason as to why. I mean, for instance, why couldn't Clark Hill, if you wanted to revisit the bylaws, why couldn't Clark Hill do that?
And I think maybe it's a very progressive thing, and that's not a bad thing.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Ms. St. John?
So I noticed in the preamble and the background for the resolution, you reference a lot of companies that have had scandals, and you helpfully attached some news articles about these, the kind of your precedent for why you want to do this, and they generally reference corporations. And I understand that you're from the corporate world, Mr. Cotton, but education isn't a business. Like, it's our job to make sure that students are educated and that we're not responsible to make profit for our shareholders. And I think that's the key difference to why corporate boards would need independent counsel to protect them, whereas no other school board in the state of Michigan has their own separate independent counsel. The only one, as Trustee Brumbaugh made sure to email us when he had this conversation with the MASB lawyer, the only other school board that has ever had, or in the past 25 years, so in recent memory, has had their own corporate counsel or their own board counsel was Flint. So if we're looking at our peer districts, which we often do to see what's a good thing to do, and the only peer district that is doing something is Flint in the past 25 years, I would argue that maybe that's not the best representation of what we should be doing, especially
I don't know if I'd say that about Flint. I mean, I believe we used the Genesee County leadership from that county. I wouldn't knock Flint. I also did include some things in there. I believe it talks to DC schools and how there were some issues, and a poorly, an organization that does not have separation between administration and the board. I don't think it matters whether it's corporate or nonprofit or a municipality. And what we don't have here is independence from administration. And it's not, again, nefarious in any way that it's set up that way, but getting these committees in place, having more line of sight, having more reporting requirements, having transparency is not a bad thing.
So I guess I'm confused again, because you said that we need to have separation from administration, but my understanding of the function of the Board of Education is to collaborate with administration to make sure that our schools are the best that they can be. So I'm not sure why we would make, I understand that you say that you're not trying to make an antagonistic relationship by having a separate legal counsel, but I mean, that's the optics of it, right? Like, that's the perception that we've seen. I haven't, again, if we're looking to our emails, every single email that we've gotten regarding this topic has been people coming up with theories as to why we would need legal counsel. As you said, I don't think you're doing it for a nefarious reason, but that's the public perception, and we are a new board that hasn't earned the public's trust yet. So I guess my biggest question is, if we're going to be spending money on this, and my question whenever I'm voting on something here is, how does the money that we're spending here, how is this resolution going to benefit the students in our district?
I would say that having a governance system in place that has reporting so that there is a line of sight that's more robust into our district will prevent possibilities that would have a much larger impact on our system and our kids absent those. And I mean, that's all I could say. I don't know how to say it any other way, except that I believe that governance requires independence. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Boards of directors at corporations are not antagonistic towards management. Nonprofit trustees are not antagonistic towards the mission of those nonprofits, whether it's a hospital or elsewhere. What it is it's allowing us to exercise our fiduciary duties so that we have some independence from the administration.
Okay. Any other comments? Are we done? Okay.
It's,
real quickly,
It's
Mrs.
just
Pappas, go right
it's a
ahead.
it's a check and balance, and there's a lot of issues going on. All you have to do is look at the Oxford situation where there were actions taken by employees that, and then you have the board that's being held on and had really nothing to do with that direct decision. So there's a lot of, there's not a lot of, but there are certain circumstances that could arise that could potentially have an effect. It could be a variety of things. And I'm not going to make any kind of, I don't want to impugn anybody's reputation up on the stage, but these people might, it could be somebody else here years from now. But there are things that occur in any kind of a system where there is a substantial budget. And this is not, please don't misunderstand me. I am not making any kinds of comments towards the people sitting on the stage, but I'm saying that it has happened in other organizations. I mean, we had a PTO situation not too long ago, a few years ago, where somebody took a substantial amount of money and is in jail for that at this point. And that was money that came out of our kids' lives and could have really helped that school and that those children. So there are certain circumstances that come up that might require the board to ask a question on a separate issue and get some kind of a legal opinion. This is not supposed to be an adversarial thing. It's supposed to be a different, it's really hard to talk when I'm interrupted. I feel like I'm in my classroom again, being interrupted by students. I try to teach them to raise their hand and wait their turn. So it's a check and balance as opposed to all the legal dollars going into one bucket. It's going into an extra bucket. You're dividing up some questions, and we will work very hard not to make anything duplicative. I don't expect it to be an incredible amount of anything right now. It's simply a separation of powers, and I think it's an important one, and if we're proactive instead of reactive, I think we're on the right path.
Okay. Any last-minute brief comments? Brief, with a capital B.
Okay. B for Brumbaugh, B for brief.
There you go.
I do think that some of the concern around the resolution, comes from the uncertainty around the resolution. So I think posting it tomorrow and the backup material that Trustee Cotton provided will help with that. And I think that when you review the resolution, the meat of it comes at the bottom where it says council engagement procedures. And I think that some of the questions that are brought up that we need to be thoughtful about are, kind of who controls that access? How do we coordinate or deconflict with administration about who's asking what questions, the why behind why we might go with one legal counsel or another. Like, these are all things that have been brought up and things that are answerable, right? Particularly when it comes to items that the school district handles in terms of the Open Meetings Act, in terms of FOIA, in terms of FERPA, in terms of HIPAA. There are lots of legal restrictions that we have to operate under that, who is asking the question, how the question gets asked, and then how the answer is shared with the board has a lot of legal implications. And it's the kind of thing where, when considering this, if we were in the policy committee, I would want to ask Mark McInerney kind of how best to do this. And I understand that that's kind of a tricky situation here because we're talking about setting a policy about how when we don't use Clark Hill, right? But there may be opportunities to kind of expand on that section of the resolution or maybe refer it to the policy and contracts committee to kind of flesh out, to address some of those specific concerns that folks have brought up. Because I think that the ambiguity about who the attorney is, how the RFP process was conducted, if the board will discuss which candidates put in RFPs, what the process is for us to ask a question, receive an answer, discuss it. These are all answerable things. So I think, over the next 3 weeks, maybe we can get some clarity on that piece, and that will help, seeing the actual documents on the website where people can download and ask questions to the board, and then having a discussion about that can kind of flesh some of these pieces out might help bring clarity to the situation.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to approval of regular meeting minutes of January 23rd, 2023. That'll be another action item. Next, we go to information and discussion, monthly financials, check register, healthcare report. Mrs. Matheson?
Thank you. I just want to take a minute to share that this report is included in the board packets every month at the second meeting of the month. So there was some discussion earlier about what additional financial reporting might look like. And as I mentioned, we'll take that up with the Finance and Facilities Committee to see if there's something different. This particular report does come directly out of our software. It shows you the a month at a time. So it shows you for this month, it's December actual, then the projected, which is budget, and then the actual year-to-date, and then whether we're over or under in each. And there are generally 2 pages. General fund, I think, flips into 3 pages for each fund, 1 page showing the revenues, and then the following 2 or 3 pages showing the expenditures. So this report is included for your review for the month of December. And then the check register is also included every month. The check register month aligns with the month of the financial reporting that we're providing, so this would also be the check register for the month of December. If you have any questions about transactions that you see in the check register at any point in time, please feel free to contact us, and we can look at the supporting documentation to get an answer back to you. And then the last report is the very last page, and that is our healthcare report. This one, we are self-funded, so this is time-lagged a little bit more. So the most recently completed month for all of our claims activity is October 2022. You can see that there is some yellow shaded lines as well as some pink shaded lines. Our medical plan year renews in April of each year. So the yellowish shading is the current rate structure, and then the pink is the projected rate structure for the renewal time. And you can see in the second to last column, total all lines. The ones that are in white, they're unshaded. Those are the actual costs to date. Please keep in mind that this is full costs, so this does not incorporate the employee cost sharing that's associated with the medical. And you can compare those numbers essentially to what's in yellow to see whether or not we are over or under as compared to budget. So this is something we were trending high for the first 3 months or so at the beginning of the year. We've now come down a little bit. This is something that we're monitoring closely, and we'll need to potentially make an adjustment in our next budget amendment, depending on where things are at that point in time.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you anticipate it trending downward again, or do you?
I would love for it to trend downward, but this is the first month so far that we've seen it come down a little bit. So, a little bit of time will tell. We get quarterly reconciliations also, and I meet with Gallagher, our third party, to review those quarterly reconciliations. Those are actually completed by Blue Cross Blue Shield. They come up with our payment schedule for the coming quarter, and kind of based on that, look back at what our actual claims experience was in comparison to that prior payment schedule. So we have only received the first quarter of the year. That's about a 7-week or so lag time between quarter ending and when we receive that quarterly settlement to be able to review.
And is there anything else you could point out to us on these reports that is atypical, that something we should be watching?
I don't think there's anything atypical included in the reports. School district finances are unique because we operate on a cash basis throughout the year, and then at fiscal year end, we have to flip to accrual basis.
Right.
We also have a variety of contracts, so some of our contracts are on a 12-month starting in July, others are 12 months starting in September. And then with the way we do our health insurance, wages are accrued at the end of the year, but the health insurance is not, and that has to do with whether or not we're operating an internal service fund for external reporting. So these are all things that I'm hopeful we'll be able to dive into a little bit further with the Finance and Facilities Committee meeting. And then at the pleasure of that committee, we can share out additional details with the full board.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions for Ms. Matheson? Okay, moving on. We have 7.2 board requests. I don't have any.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know I should submit them ahead of time. I have 2 board requests, actually.
Okay, go right ahead.
So we've talked a lot today just about the committees, the Facilities and Finance Committee, and Ms. Matheson asking them about things. We voted on January 9th to establish these committees, and I know a survey was sent out to community members that same week. I've been contacted by a lot of community members asking when they're going to hear if they've been appointed to a committee, and I have the same question.
Okay, I can give you an update on that. We had a 208, I want to say 209 people that filled out the survey form. We had, prior to the survey form being posted, probably another 20 people that inquired as to serving on the committees. The committees that we're working on putting together right now are the Finance and Facilities and the Policy and Contracts, because those are two committees that were in place beforehand. I anticipate those invitations will go out. We're waiting for Mr. McInerney for some documents to send out to those committee members. He said we'll have them by the end of the week. I anticipate those invitations being going out over the weekend to those committee members that are going to be requested to serve on those committees.
Okay, will board members also be notified of their appointments to the committees
Right.
at that time?
Without question.
Okay, and then my second one is just, Mr. Cotton had referenced that he sent out inquiries to 5 law firms, you said, and gotten responses. Will the board be provided those responses so that we can see? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we move on to future meetings. We have a Board of Education workshop meeting on Wednesday, January 25th at 6 p.m., the Morningside Boardroom. We have a Board of Education regular meeting, February 13, 2023, at 7 p.m. at Brownell Multipurpose Room.
6:30 p.m.
Oh, whoops.
Now you changed it, so it'll be updated to be 6:30.
Got it.
Sorry, just trying
Thank
to keep
you.
everybody informed.
No, I'm glad you picked up on that. Thank you. Then we have, next item is public comment on non-action items. I'll read the standard preface. We welcome comments and questions related to matters within the purview of the Board of Education. Prior to addressing the board, we recommend that speakers first discuss their topic and seek resolution with relevant staff and administrators, culminating with the superintendent. The board will not discuss individual student or staff matters or pending litigation in this forum, and the chair will rule those comments out of order, as well as any commenters who use inappropriate language such as profanity or other language that disrupts the order of this meeting. Comments are addressed to the chair and are limited to 3 minutes, but we are happy to discuss any matters further outside this formal meeting. When called to the podium, please state your name and city of address. The first person I have is Carol Steen. Is she still here? Okay. After Ms. Steen is Joshua Neds Fox. And after Mr. Fox is Mrs. Subel.
Thank you. Joshua Neds Fox, Grosse Pointe Farms. On the budget parameters, Parameter 2 directs the district to focus on recommendations from local law enforcement. Department of Education data makes it clear that nationally, school policing disproportionately affects Black students and kids with disabilities at almost twice the rate of the overall student population. 1 in 4 students in our schools are not white, and I know the vulnerabilities of our disabled students, having shepherded my own congenitally disabled daughter through our system. This directive to focus on law enforcement priorities is at odds with safety data, which shows that the results will be inherently inequitable, in contradiction with equity provisions in the district's strategic plan. I encourage the board to remove the final sentence in Parameter 2 to allow the district flexibility in developing strategies to increase student safety without subjecting our students to inequitable contact with the criminal justice system. The Parameter 1 direction, restricting the district from making any changes to enrollment policies or practices, is counterproductive to Board Policy 63C provision that the board allow for flexibility in the administration's approach to budget development. And tying the district's hands on enrollment policy is a poor way to encourage innovation. Participation in schools of choice would be a rational and effective change in policy to supplement the point student population, to the benefit of state funding levels, diversity and inclusion goals, staff satisfaction and retention, and improvement of the point's reputation in the regional and national imagination. I encourage the board to remove the Parameter 1 directive against changes in enrollment policies and practices, including the proposed addition prohibiting schools of choice. Finally, I strongly encourage this board to reject the proposal to secure separate legal counsel from the district at large. The MASB can find almost no precedent over the last few decades for this practice. Maureen Krasner last week shared an alarming litany of questions about the legality, conflicts of interest, and practical complications involved in this move, questions which by themselves would counsel pause. But more concerning is that you see your business this term as at odds with the legal interests of the district itself. This proposal positions you as antagonists to the body you were elected to represent, anticipating not just conflict with the district, but conflict rising to the level of legal divergence. This should be alarming to any reasonable observer. This proposal is ethically questionable, and the district's council are not only well-vetted, expert, and already budgeted for, but they align with the best interests of the district and the students, which is not coincidentally also in your best interest as a board. Please don't further erode the reputation this board has developed for transparent and ethical practice. Reject the proposed approval of separate legal counsel next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Ms. Chabelle? After Ms. Chabelle is Dr. D'Angelo.
I wanted to speak to, I think it would be parameter 4, which is innovative program offerings, but it might also be parameter 2, student health and safety. I was at the special meeting on Thursday. I saw a lot of interest from students, from staff, from emergency doctors that we deal with mental health. And if I was tracking things correctly, the majority of people up on the stage of our board also felt that mental health needs should be dealt with, though they disagreed, or some people disagreed, with the proposal for the agreement with Corewell Health in this state. So I'd like to see mental health mentioned as one of the program innovations that will be there, because there seemed to be a consensus on the board that it should be dealt with, but not that way that had been proposed. So I'd like to see that. I would also, given the conversation I heard earlier today, I'd also like to support Mr. Fox in asking that the additional legal counsel not be approved. If I'm understanding the budget correctly, the $3 million cut from a bucket that's 40 but really only 15, we'd be adding that. We'd be adding an expense into a bucket that we're saying we need to cut $3 million from. And I didn't hear anything tonight that really explained why that was so important that we would add that expense at a time we're trying to cut it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. D'Angelo. After Dr. D'Angelo's, Lucretia Felder.
Dr. Christopher D'Angelo. I'm in Grosse Pointe Park. I've got 2 kids, third grade and first grade at defer. So high parent and community member participation helps create the foundation for successful school districts. Districts with high participation are higher quality. These late meetings on Mondays are what you signed up for. They're at 7 p.m. so that they can be accessible and people can participate. But I came to talk about quality and leadership today. How do we measure quality and move it forward? Many ways to measure it. Goals should be to improve quality. I hope we can agree on this, even if we don't agree on what constitutes quality. Good leadership is founded in due diligence and is focused on quality. President Ismail, you're the trustee who prides himself on promoting fiscal responsibility for the school system on the behalf of the elderly population of the community. Hiring a separate law firm exclusively for a few select board members is a waste of resources. The district already contracts for legal services. Fees for canceling the clinic and associated administrative expense in vetting it are similarly cavalier with taxpayer money. If there's a $150,000 penalty and another $100,000 in suck and mid costs associated with planning already, that's 1/4 the outlay of the construction of the clinic. Meanwhile, you seem to feel it necessary to increase fees for Little League Baseball to the tune of $30,000 just for the park. That's $125 additional per child and 1 less week of baseball. How many families might make the choice not to play just due to additional costs? Don't we already pay for the maintenance and upkeep of those fields once as taxpayers? Why should we pay again? Where would all these additional funds be spent, and how is that justified? None of this is very fiscally responsible and seems to be duplication of expenses for the district and community. These decisions are lacking in due diligence and will not improve quality. Central question, do you want to continue to divide the community? Is that what you want your legacy to be? Or do you want to compromise and come together and move forward? Are we willing to step back from all our disagreements and actually consider what a robust 10 and 15-year plan looks like? I mean, you can look at all these things, best, likely, and worst case scenario. You can put numbers on paper and say, this is what we're likely looking at over a long period of time. That's what needs to happen. I hope you can do that, because that's what leadership looks like. Thank you.
Ms. Felder, after Ms. Felder is Chris Scipione.
Laketria Felder, Grosse Pointe Park, District Parent, Taxpayer. On January 19th, the board voted against establishing a grant-funded adolescent clinic at Grosse Pointe North, which presented an opportunity for students to have expanded access to mental health care and physical health care at school. Though the board halted the establishment of that clinic, I was encouraged to hear Trustee Pappas reiterate and express her deep commitment to providing mental health services and finding alternative funding. I encourage you all to take up that mantle and to do so. Thank you for making your position clear in favor of mental health care for support of our students. As you heard from community members, school counselors, teachers, and administrators, mental health care is a priority and should be prioritized by this board. However, the budget parameters does not once mention mental health care. I ask you to revise the budget parameters. Perhaps budget parameter 2, which seems like a logical place to include that language, given your stated goal of caring for the physical well-being of both students and staff. You cannot talk about and promote safety without considering mental health care. When students are healthy, safe, and mentally stable, you create a positive learning environment. I encourage you to revisit budget parameter 2. As you are exploring funding options to support resource officers and law enforcement recommendations, please remember to explore those same funding options for mental health care services in our district. This board has demonstrated that it is eager to make changes. You have the opportunity to establish Grosse Pointe Public Schools as a gold standard as compared to our other peer districts. You can do that by providing mental health services. Tonight, I was also encouraged by hearing Trustee Cotton discuss the progressive nature of securing separate legal counsel. I ask you to also embrace a progressive mentality when you're thinking about school safety and mental health care and providing services for our students to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris Scipione, after that is Shannon Byrne and Rosie Knapp.
Chris Scipione, Grosse Pointe City. I would like to discuss my concerns regarding the current Board of Education and the plan to seek separate legal counsel from the school district. My first concern relates to the budgetary aspect. We have heard today that $3 million needs to be cut from support services. I think it's important to juxtapose the decision of prioritizing free legal fees for Board of Education members potentially over removal of trash and sewage from our schools. Specifically, what are we cutting from the budget from the children to support these legal services? My second concern is the selection process for this legal counsel. The Board of Education Policies Manual, Article 6, Section 6.05 states, in situations where professional services are deemed necessary for the district, the criteria and basis for selection will be determined by the Board of Education following recommendations from the superintendent on a case-by-case basis. Article 6 of this policy manual states that these contracts generally should go to the lowest responsible bidder. If this is the case, why is one of the members of the Board of Education, who happens to be an attorney, soliciting the bids for the legal representation for the Board of Education? This arrangement has a high risk for conflicts of interest to occur. Would it be commonplace for Board of Education members who are engineers or architects to be able to solicit bids from companies from their colleagues? The district superintendent should be in charge of this process. In this particular case, candidates need to be heavily vetted to ensure there's no conflict of interest, as at least 2 members of the Board of Education are attorneys and could award this contract to colleagues, friends, or family members. Furthermore, as this legal representation would represent the whole Board of Education and not any individual, it seems only reasonable that the Board of Education decision should be unanimous on which law firm to hire. Elsewise, taxpayer dollars would go towards funding legal services for individual board members or faction of the Board of Education. In a situation where the dispute arises amongst individual members of the Board of Education, the conclusion is inescapable that there, in that case, must then be a third legal counsel to represent the other members of the Board of Education, and so on. If individual legal representation is what certain board members truly want, then my response to them would be the same as the Board of Education response to the district health clinic. There are legal services all around this area. Feel free to pay for them with your own money. Thank you.
Next, we have Shannon Byrne. After that, Rosie Knapp and Clint Erringer.
Hello, Shannon Byrne, Grosse Pointe Farms. I want to just quickly note, when Trustee Cotton moved that the BOE pursue interviewing its own legal counsel at the January 4th meeting, and when 4 members immediately voted yes, it appears that vote was an out-of-order vote, according to bylaw 1.40.2. And while I agree that Robert's rules is really important, following the bylaws of this board is paramount, and I do hope moving forward, I realize that was the first meeting, it was kind of a quick deal and it just came up out of nowhere, so I totally get it, but I hope moving forward that we're going to be following the process and bylaws of this board. I'm also really glad tonight to hear that the public is going to have an opportunity to see this BOE council proposal. As others have noted, there is a difference between corporate governance and school board governance. And again, being new and having not gone through that process that you go through in a couple days, maybe that will help clarify some things. According to Mr. Benazik, I hope, as quoted, he's from the Michigan Association of School Boards. As quoted in the Detroit News, he's the Michigan Association of School Boards Director of Legal Services, and this is his direct quote. The school board is the client of the district's legal counsel. An attorney has an ethical responsibility to represent the school board interest in all matters. There should not be any question that the district legal counsel is representing the school board. I can't see any situation where the interest of the school board is different than the district. So that's coming from, an expert. He also stated the only board he knows to have done so in the last 25 years was Flint, who had a very unique situation. So really, like others, I'm wondering why a virtually unprecedented move to spend taxpayer money on separate BOE legal counsel is necessary now. What highly unusual circumstance is this board worried about, planning for, expecting, where the interests of the board would conflict with the interests of the district this board is charged with serving? And most importantly, how will this unprecedented expenditure of taxpayer money in a time of looming budget cuts support your primary charge to oversee the education, safety, and welfare of our students? Thank you.
Thank you. Rosie Knapp.
Rosie Knapp, Grosse Pointe Farms. It's a meat locker in here, guys. Just want to say we're all freezing. So I also want to address parameter 2 when we talk about enhancing the safety and physical well-being of our students. I would love to see something added in there about the mental health of our students. And, just to drive it home, let's think about what these active shooter drills are doing to our children. We probably all grew up without them, and fire drills was really all I ever experienced when I went to school as a young child. So, knowing some families who have teenagers and having talked about this, their children are stressed out every time they do active shooter drills. At the elementary level, I don't think the anxiety is that there's as much stress for them because it's done differently. But I know that a lot of our teens are experiencing high anxiety and stress, and then you've got, false threats that come in and make it even worse for these kids. So I urge you to find it in the budget to add to the parameters, and find it in the budget to include that when we talk about the safety and physical well-being of our kids. not going to get into anything else in that parameter at this time because we'll see how that, what you can bring forth in regards to the safety of our kids. I also echo the concerns regarding hiring your own counsel, so I won't go into all that either, but I have very deep concerns about that myself. And then early education, early childhood education was brought up. Forgive me, I did not write down the parameter, and then I lost a signal. But something that was brought to my attention that I told a neighbor I would mention if the time ever was appropriate, that there's a lot of people are a little upset that there's a lottery system for our preschool for Grosse Pointe residents, and that we bring in that lottery system for, and cut me off if I'm incorrect and this is inappropriate, but that there's a lottery system for preschool aged families from outside the district as well, and is that, I'm not sure if that's factual, if that's true, but if it is, if I put my email address on there, Mr. Ishmael, if you could just shoot me an email and explain that to me so I can give them an answer, that would be fantastic, because I had a few families ask me to look into that for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Derringer.
Hi, Clint Derringer, Grosse Pointe City. I first would start off by praising or thanking you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Cotton for facilitating a collaborative exercise on the budget parameters. It was nice to hear all of the trustees and their voice and their input as you reviewed them. There were a couple parameters that I think that we omitted. Who may have brought that forward? If we could add that to the record, I really appreciated that sentiment, so thank you. The parameter number 5 about attracting and retaining high-quality staff, I think is paramount. I think it's central to our mission and how we're going to go forward and be successful as a district. And there's a lot of synergy with that parameter, some others. However, there's some ambiguity with that parameter and some others, specifically the healthcare cost containment. I ask that you use caution and remember that not everything boils down to dollars and cents. Sometimes it's about how you respect the people that you're putting into your employ. Additionally, I would say I think we need some clarity in the discussion between now and the time that you guys take a vote on the budget parameters. It definitely sounded as if you wanted to remove the formula, but you stated directly that that is not what you're doing. I really think that needs to be clarified before there's a vote taken. I think that's one of the most highly charged items that could come up to this board, and I think it should be absolutely clear whether we are or are not in favor of that, whether it's a negotiating leverage or not. I think it's clear that the board is 100% clear, or I think it's imperative that the board is 100% clear on that. And then the last thing I would say is to remove the general fund equity as a metric for the district, something that we just saw a historical presentation back to 2011. We've been measured by general fund equity. I think it would be a mistake to remove that as a measuring metric. We clearly would then be starting some new metric system where we are not measured to our past. It would be awfully convenient to point at the general fund equity and its decline in the last 2 years as a campaign speech, and then remove it once you were going to be measured by that same metric. So I appreciate your guys' collaboration. Again, I think there's a lot of synergy here. I would just ask that we remove some of that ambiguity. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Jadana Dingus.
Good evening, Jadana Dingus, Grosse Pointe Woods. I echo what Rosie said, it's a meat locker in here. First of all, you guys talked about power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you want power. You ran for the school board. All of you ran on a platform of helping the kids, but it seems to be much more about you than it is about the kids. And I'm really ticked off because, again, you got me agreeing with Ms. Warden. No disrespect, Ms. Warden, that was a joke. But I appreciate what Ms. Warden said, that, I don't know that Mr. Cotton is a practicing attorney. She's a practicing attorney, and she's disagreeing about hiring separate counsel. So I think when you go to listen to experts, you should listen to the practicing attorney on the board, okay? That you don't need to, if you are seeking to operate transparently, you're being about as transparent as mud right now. You can't tell anyone why you need separate counsel. This is seeming real shady. And I am really disappointed that you cannot give an answer. You couldn't give an answer to Ms. Warden. You couldn't give an answer to Ms. St. John about why you need it. And you couldn't give an answer to us. And you want to cut the budget and then slide in there a new attorney. Make it make sense, because the math ain't mathing.
Thank you. That concludes public comments on non-action items. Other comments from board members and superintendent. We'll start with Assistant Superintendent Bishop.
No comment.
Assistant Superintendent Matheson.
No comment.
Come on, you can come up with something.
I've had enough tonight, thanks.
Trustee Brumbaugh.
We appreciate all of your comments and the reports that you presented to us. It's
Thank
really
you.
important to the,
Yes.
the health and proper function of the district, and we really value you. So, I like the idea that came up in public comment about adding expansion of mental health services to parameter 2. I think given the discussion that was going on at the time about the clinic and whether or not it was going to continue or not, adding that in there as well didn't really come up as a topic of discussion, but I think, like many of you pointed out, the consensus on the board that, hey, this is something that we want, this is something that we need, the consensus in the community that we should do it, means that it's something that we should pursue seriously. Like I said at the last meeting, that might be difficult if we're not willing to spend taxpayer funds on that, but perhaps there's another way to approach that problem, and I think having a serious discussion about that is important. Because like our teachers, in my experience in service, too often law enforcement takes on unfunded mental health and social work mandates because they're the first and sometimes the only point of contact in an emergent situation. So I would encourage us to put our money where our mouth is in terms of growing mental health services and expand parameter 2 to take a more full spectrum approach to student safety. I also wanted to make a comment that I think that the budget parameters touched on a really important piece, which is the importance of clear communication, proactive communication, and highlighting the strengths of the districts and good news stories. I think a common thing I've brought up when we've discussed amongst ourselves and members of the community, if somebody Googles one of our schools, I don't want the first thing that shows up to be niche, which sometimes is good and sometimes is problematic. I want them to see 18 articles about the robotics team and the awards that our show choir is winning and our great athletics. And I think that I thank Mary Ann Brush for the presentation she gave earlier this evening, and she usually does in terms of good news, the calendar, which I'm excited to show off at the office, but all the work that the communications team has done and has only been able to do because we've grown that asset in the school district to be more proactive in that space and help shape the narrative around the school district so people see the reality of the situation and all the strengths of the district. So that helps with enrollment, it helps with community engagement, it helps with satisfaction. It touches so many pieces of the budget parameters. And I think being thoughtful about increasing our investment in our communications work will be important in order to make sure that we achieve those things. And just like I said in our discussion about the legal counsel and to echo Mr. Derringer's comments about the really detailed discussion we had about our budget parameters, I think this board operates best when we're operating with clarity and transparency. And I think we saw a lot of that in the budget parameter discussion tonight. And I think as we post the pieces around the legal counsel proposal, and we have a more, detailed discussion of that. I think that we'll get to that place of clarity and transparency where we can make a responsible choice. So hopefully we can continue operating in that vein. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Pappas.
Yes, I want to start by really just extending my thanks to Treasurer Cotton and Deputy Superintendent Amanda Matheson and President Ishmael. I know had some work on all these budget parameters, tremendous amount of work going on to organize the board, and the thought that you put into the parameters, and even itemizing who gave you and the page numbers, I thought was really great. I've never seen that done before, and I thought that was a really extra detail that was above and beyond, so thank you. It's a lot of work. Every time, you have a change in the board, there's going to be growing pains as we get through things, and it's this budget is a huge piece that hits early on. I mean, you have a barely elected new group of people, and you're deciding and making budget parameters that are going to affect everybody in the district for a long time to come. So it's not something that anyone takes lightly. It's a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes, so thank you for that. I don't want to say much other than I think we've heard lots of great ideas here tonight. I think these budget parameters are going to be a framework for us to work within. We want to be fiscally responsible, but we want to continue the state-of-the-art education, and we want to make sure that we are addressing needs in our district and with our students are very important, and they are within our conversations on a regular basis. I want to just take a shout out on the school safety part. Some misperceptions maybe on school resource officers. I happen to have worked with quite a few school resource officers in the various schools I've worked in. Many of the schools I've worked have had a school resource officer, and they have been an amazing ally for the students. They have prevented actually a lot of things proactively because of their relationships with the students. And oftentimes there were students that might be acting out in a way, and it was the school resource officer that was able to take them aside, talk to them, explain to them maybe the long-term repercussions of their behavior, and it changed their outlook at school, it changed their behavior. They were there to prevent some very serious incidents, or they were there when the incidents occurred. And I'll tell you that teachers and students alike look to those resource officers when things are happening, and I'm not talking about major things like, a school shooting. I'm talking about just average things that sometimes happen. We've had our schools locked down on various crime events near. We had some bank robberies going on for a while that I know Richard was locked down a couple of times, and I think South. Those are, when you talk about mental health, and I love the parent that commented on the lockdown drills, because as a teacher I've had to do them, and I agree. I think that's one thing we can do, and we can look at ways of doing it as best as possible, because it's really a hard thing to do for teachers. It's a hard thing to do for the students, and to do it well. I will say that we went on a tour. There was a principal that was doing some drills. Can you refresh my memory? Which? Monteith. I thought it was Monteith. I didn't want to say the wrong school. And I was just blown away by this principal and by the way she did it, and the kids, and the way it was done, and there was no fear. If anyone should be training elementary, in particular, people how to present that information, she's the one to do it. She was amazing. And those kids weren't frightened, and they knew what she said. I think you're going to want to see them model these drills. And the kids were amazing. They knew exactly what to do. They weren't scared. They really had a grasp, and these were young kids, that this was, practice in case. And they went through lockdowns and fire drills and tornado drills, and it was really cool to see the kids going through these drills. And I thought, wow, those are kids that if something really goes down, they're going to know exactly what to do. And I always tell my students, I'm a music teacher, so I always tell them, it's just like when we line up for a performance, we practice going on the stage, we practice going off the stage like multiple times, and we talk about things that might happen in the concert, and in case something happens, if somebody gets dizzy, sit down, and the people next to them watch over that person. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It just means that we're preparing so that we know what to do when it happens. And so I try to give it kind of that thing, so we've got to really take it seriously, and I try to make it approachable but real with my kids. But the school safety officers, they give a really level of mental health care to teachers and students alike, because they feel safer when these people that we know personally are in the building and something happens. People immediately go get, officer so-and-so. And I've worked with some incredible people in this field, and it has made the difference, I think, and it makes the kids react differently when they see that the police are not always their enemy, but somebody that they can trust and rely on. And last but not least, these officers, when they're in our buildings, God forbid anything did seriously happen, the amount of time we save having someone in our building who knows exactly where maybe the band room is, or where exactly that classroom is, or that door is open, that's not a level of familiarity that an outside police officer would have. They might have a general idea. Our officers in our communities are awesome, but having somebody in the building that knows that building and all the little odds, especially like a building like South or North, huge buildings, it's great. I mean, there's a lot of elements to that. So I think there's lots we can do to increase mental health beyond that, but I think the safety part of it, I can't emphasize enough, is really important. So thanks again for the hard work and the budget parameters. I look forward to the further discussions.
Thank you. Trustee St. John.
So yeah, I just want to thank the communications team and anyone else who was responsible for the nice calendars and recognizing us for National School Board Month. This board as a whole has only been seated for less than a month, so I know that we have not earned your trust as a community yet, and I hope that we will earn your trust in the future by listening to the public and making sure that all of our decisions center on what's best for the students. I think that's our main goal up here, and I hope that in the future we can make sure that all of our decisions focus on what we can do best for the students. So thank you to everyone who comes out and makes public comment, and I hope you keep coming out to make public comments so that we know what the community wants and we can be responsive to that, and make sure that we're serving the public as we were elected to do. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows that this Friday and Saturday is Matilda Jr. at Pierce Middle School. And I would be telling you it's a great production, even if the cutest kid in the world wasn't part of it. But it's at 7 p.m. on Friday and 2 p.m. on Saturday at Pierce Middle School if you want to go see some of the amazing things our kids are doing. It's really very impressive what they can get middle schoolers to do in musical theater. I'm so impressed with our teachers and staff who pull that off. So that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have two announcements. February 2nd is Skilled Trades Career Night at Grosse Pointe North. It's from 6 to 8 o'clock. And I appreciate...
What day did you say?
It's February 2nd?
February 28th.
2nd. Two.
It's changed?
Okay, I'm going to look at Mrs. Brush, who's been organizing it, not to be difficult, but to get clarity. What's the date, Mrs. Brush?
28th, sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry,
don't want that in either.
I can't read my own handwriting. Sorry. February 28th, sorry. I took it right from our communications team posted it on our social media, and I wrote it down, and I wrote again, sorry, my own handwriting is terrible. But I think this is going to be a great night. I know that I appreciate our administration putting this into place. We did pass a resolution last board session, to emphasize CTE and skilled trades, and I appreciate that this is available for the community to take part in. I also would like to announce that the Winter Spectacular from the Grosse Pointe South Choir is being held, make sure I have this date correct. I think that's February 2nd, correct? Okay. Winter Spectacular. It's at Grosse Pointe North, but it's the Grosse Pointe South Choir, and that is February 2nd, which I believe is it's a Thursday night.
Yes, that is the 2nd.
Okay. I want to thank Amanda Matheson, Deputy Superintendent of Operations, for the great work you did on the budget. I appreciate that presentation so much. It was clear all of those those graphs were just very easy to read, and I appreciate your work in explaining that to us. I also want to appreciate and acknowledge the work that Treasurer Cotton did on the budget parameters. It was a collaborative effort, and I appreciate the inclusiveness of all of our ideas into the budget parameters. It does look like we are attempting to attain financial stability and also promote excellence in academics, and also making sure that our students are safe and well-rounded, and also attain and keep the best teachers in the state and staff in the state. The last thing, this actually two more quick things. Again, I want to just emphasize that I just hope that if you do a quick Google search of attorney-client relationship, especially when it comes to government boards, the client is the board. I say this probably every other meeting. I did represent 30 different municipalities before I was a prosecutor, and so I sat on these boards on a regular basis as their attorney, and my client was the board. It wasn't the township supervisor, it wasn't the mayor of cities, it was the township board or the city board. So I just want to make sure that we're not being duplicative in our efforts in a time when we're cutting, $3 million here, other cuts here, there, and there. I hope we're not spending money on attorneys that we don't need, especially when we have great attorneys who are here to represent the board because we're the client. And I'm going to get those questions to our president so that we can take a look at those questions that I asked at the next board meeting. I'm looking forward to the appointment of the committee meetings. I know that we discussed last time that the Finance Committee was going to be the committee that's going to talk about potentially looking at alternative fundings for the health clinic that we decided not to pursue last week. And I'm looking forward to that committee starting so that we can start looking to alternative funding so that we can, in fact, get that clinic back in our district. And I would agree with Mr. Brumbaugh and to the several speakers who said that we should include mental health as part of our budget parameters. Thank you.
Trustee Jupe.
Hi. Well, my takeaways from the last month and from tonight, there's a reality that the Grosse Pointe Public School enrollment is at an all-time low. And our pandemic relief fund is ending in 2024. Our numbers are, for 2021, we're 7,338 students, with 2022 at 6,638 students, which is, that's 700 student loss. And we have some tough choices to make because of that. But I think it's been a great start to coming together with a thoughtful plan. And Trustee Cotton did a great job at getting the perimeters together and this board as a whole. And I can see hope for us coming together and working together and doing some great things in the future. We live in a great community. We have responsibility to set clear expectations for the district. That's why we're up here. And there's much work to be done between now and June 30th. But I expect we will come together and make that happen. I have great confidence that we will continue to have tough discussions and debates, but in the end, we're going to come together to do what is right for our district and for the community. And then, Dr. Dean, I have a quick message from my little one. She wants you to keep your eye on the weather, because we hear this rumor of a potential snow day, maybe potentially in the near future.
She would not be the first one to contact me today, Mrs. Tripp, so we'll just keep an eye on it.
Tell her to put her boots on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Cotton.
I just want to thank everybody for collaborating on this, especially Mrs. Matheson. This was not the hard part. The hard part is now the administration putting this together and trying to figure out how to meet these parameters. I will try and get as much as I can. I'm hoping to get this back to everybody by Thursday or Friday, incorporating as much as possible in there. And I would agree with you, Trustee Warden, that the way you just described them, I think is perfect. If you have that written down, I'd love for you to email it. If not, I'm thinking that I could just watch the video back, but putting that as a preamble at the top, it was really a great, synthesis of what we're trying to achieve with these parameters. But again, I want to thank everybody for helping put these together.
Thank you. Dr. Dean?
Just two quick points. One, a point of clarity. I've said this before. We don't do active shooter drills with our students. I didn't want that to be out in the ether. I recognize that I'm not trying to correct a person, but I do want to provide that clarity. I think that's really important. We took our staff through that without students in August. We do lockdown drills with our students. That's required by state law, but we do not frame them as active shooter drills with our students, because I would agree from a mental health perspective that isn't what we would want to do. The other thing is I'd just like to thank Mr. Cotton, Mr. Ishmael. I would echo what Mr. Cotton said in the sense of this was a collaborative process around budget parameters. Like anytime there's a collaboration, not like no one person probably loves everything inside of there, but we did work our way through that, and I appreciated, I know Mrs. Matheson and Dr. Bishop appreciated the opportunity to weigh in on those and work through drafts, and we appreciate that. So I just appreciate that opportunity.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody that came tonight for your comments, and thank the board members for their input. I think the budget parameters, the way this has been handled, is the way we want to do business. I think that take the collaborative nature to get everybody's input, try to crystallize it into a document that's fluid, yet it gives us some direction and gives the administration guidelines to work in is what we need to be about. We need to be proactive in what we're doing, and I'm looking forward for this budget process to be a productive one. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.